far below the surface of the Black Sea, beyond the blue water that still catches light, beyond the layers where ordinary life can reach, there are places that do not look like the bottom of a sea at all. There are slopes that resemble ancient shorelines. There are drowned river mouths. There are old surfaces that seem to belong to a world that once stood in the open air. If you could descend slowly enough, and if the darkness could somehow be lifted without disturbing anything, you would not be looking only at mud and rock. You would be looking at the remains of a vanished edge of land, a human horizon that may once have been familiar to people who woke to wind, followed paths near the water, tied boats to the shore, dried fish, carried reeds, mended tools, and watched the level of the world change year after year. That thought is what gives the Black Sea its unusual, quiet power. It is not only a body of water between Europe and Asia, it is also a lid placed over older ground. Beneath it may lie the traces of an inhabited landscape so broad that, from a distance, it is tempting to picture it as a whole lost country. Not a country in the modern sense, with flags, capitals, and fixed borders, but a country in the older human sense, a lived-in place, a place with roots, habits, fishing grounds, sleeping places, burial places, stories, and names that have not survived, a country made of memory long before writing. And because that world disappeared before anyone could count its people, measure its fields, or record its losses, one question hangs over the water with unusual weight. When the land went under, how many lives went with it? Before we settle into this story, take a moment to subscribe if these long, quiet journeys through the past are the kind of company you like at this hour. And while you're here, tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what the clock says where you are right now. I always like to picture these histories traveling through different rooms, different cities, and different late-night hours, while we follow an old shoreline into darkness together. The Black Sea has always carried a certain reputation. Even its modern name feels heavy. Sailors, merchants, empires, and armies all passed across it, but it never quite became ordinary in the way some seas do. It sits in a strange position, nearly enclosed, connected to the Mediterranean only through narrow passages, its waters shaped by rivers from a huge surrounding region. The Danube, the Dniester, the Dnieper, the Don, and many smaller rivers feed into the lands around it. It gathers weather, trade, migration, and war from a wide geography. Yet for all of that, the Black Sea also has a stillness that is different from open ocean stillness. It feels contained, almost inward-looking, as though it is keeping hold of something. Part of that feeling comes from the sea's physical structure. The deeper waters of the Black Sea are famously low in oxygen, which gives them unusual preserving power. In some conditions, organic materials that would decay more quickly elsewhere can survive longer here. Wood, fibers, worked surfaces, old wrecks, and other fragile traces may endure in ways that make archaeologists pay close attention. That has helped create an image of the Black Sea not only as a sea, but as an archive. An archive is a comforting word when the subject is paper, ink, shelves, and labels. It is a less comforting word when the archive is hundreds of feet underwater. Yet that is exactly what makes this place so absorbing. Somewhere beneath the shifting surface, beneath storms and fishing boats and container ships and naval patrols, there may be evidence of a landscape that once breathed in open air. Ancient coasts do not disappear in the way smoke disappears. They sink, they are covered, they are altered, but their shape can remain. In certain conditions, their clues can remain as well. That does not mean the Black Sea floor is a neatly preserved lost world waiting to be lifted into view like a buried city in a storybook. Sea floors are messy. sediment moves, coasts erode, rivers change course. Later activity disturbs earlier layers. Human hopes can run ahead of the evidence. Yet something important remains true even after all those cautions are placed in order. The modern surface of the Black Sea is younger than the deeper story beneath it. What lies below is not only marine history, it may also be land history. And that small change in wording matters. Once you stop thinking of the Black Sea as only water, the whole emotional shape of the place changes. The sea becomes something laid over an earlier world. Every map of its shoreline begins to feel incomplete. The coast you can see becomes only the latest coast. To understand why people speak of a drowned world beneath the Black Sea, it helps to slow down and picture the end of the Ice Age, not as a dramatic single moment, but as a long, uneven release. For thousands of years, huge ice sheets had locked up vast amounts of the planet's water. Shorelines across the world were not where they are today. Places now underwater were once dry. Rivers crossed plains that have since vanished under rising seas. Human groups moved across terrain that modern maps do not show. As global temperatures rose and ice melted, sea levels around the world began to climb. Not all at once, not evenly, not with the same local effect in every basin. But the broad fact is clear. Water moved back into places it had once left exposed. Coasts shifted, estuaries expanded, shelves drowned. Familiar paths would have been lost within the span of generations. In some places, the change was probably gradual enough to notice only in memory. In others, it may have felt sharper, more threatening, less forgiving. The Black Sea Basin occupied a very sensitive position in that changing world. It was not fully cut off, but neither was it simply open to the wider oceans. Narrow connections mattered. Differences in water level mattered. River inflow mattered. Salinity mattered. A basin like this could behave in ways that were dramatic even without becoming the single largest story of post-Ice Age flooding. A relatively small threshold, if crossed, could transform a coast. So when researchers began to study old shorelines, sediment layers, shells, and underwater features in and around the Black Sea, the possibility emerged that the region had experienced an immense change in water coverage during prehistory. This was not merely a matter of a beach moving inland. The suggestion was larger than that. If the basin had once held lower water, then a vast surrounding zone may have been exposed or at least more accessible land than it is now. Human communities living there would have occupied a coastal world that later ceased to exist. This is where the image of an entire country beneath the Black Sea takes hold. It is a dramatic phrase, yes, but it survives because it gives shape to something that numbers and sediment charts alone do not. What was lost may not have been a single settlement or a narrow strip of coast. It may have been an entire connected human environment, spread around lower shores, river mouths, wetlands, fishing grounds, and gently sloping land now unreachable without submersibles and sonar. And still, even at this early stage, another truth must be kept in view. The exact pace, scale, and timing of the flooding have long been debated. The strongest version of the story is not the only version. That matters, because the emotional meaning changes depending on how the water came in. A sudden disaster leaves one kind of memory. A slower drowning leaves another. When people imagine land lost beneath the sea, they often imagine something already famous. A stone city, a palace, a wall, columns rising out of the silt. The imagination likes ruins that are obvious from a distance, but most human landscapes are not like that at all. Most people in prehistory did not live among monuments meant to survive thousands of years. They lived in homes built from wood, clay, reeds, packed earth, fiber, hides, branches, and other perishable materials. Their paths were beaten into the ground by repetition. Their storage areas, hearths, fishing places, work surfaces, and burial grounds became meaningful because they were used, not because they were grand. That is why a drowned prehistoric landscape can be harder to recognize and, in some ways, more moving than a drowned city of stone. It belonged to ordinary people. If there were villages around the lower Black Sea margins before the water rose, they may have been made of materials that leave delicate traces, post holes, burned patches of earth, scattered pottery, stone tools, animal bones, seeds, layers of habitation so subtle that only careful work can distinguish them from natural debris. A place once full of daily life might survive only as a pattern. Yet a pattern can tell a great deal. It can suggest repeated use of a shore. It can show where people cooked, where they cut fish, where they stored grain, where they repaired nets, where they discarded broken objects, where they returned season after season. Once the possibility of such sites is admitted, the Black Sea floor becomes emotionally harder to treat as empty. Even when direct proof remains limited, the setting itself pushes the question back toward us. If people lived along coasts everywhere else in the prehistoric world, why would they not have lived along those coasts too? The answer may be that they did. And if they did, then the land beneath the Black Sea did not disappear as anonymous ground. It disappeared as a lived place. Morning fires went out there for the last time. Children walked there for the last time. Small boats were dragged onto beaches that no longer exist. Tools were laid down. Food was stored. Arguments were had. Songs were heard. People grew old beside water that may not have looked dangerous until it was already advancing beyond old memory. It is easy, from the safety of the modern map, to think of sea level rise as a technical process. A chart goes up, a shoreline shifts, a contour line disappears. But no ancient person lived inside a chart. They lived inside habits. Their world was measured not in abstract elevation, but in where the reeds began, where the fish gathered, how long it took to reach the next camp, where the children could safely walk, which tree marked a boundary, where the graves were, where the water had always stopped before. That final phrase matters more than it first appears, where the water had always stopped before. The whole human meaning of the Black Sea mystery is hidden inside that kind of boundary. Once such a boundary begins to fail, ordinary life becomes fragile very quickly. One of the most powerful things about the Black Sea story is that it rests on a threshold between the visible and the inferred. Some parts are grounded in geology, some parts are built from archaeology. Some parts remain debated, and some parts live in the large, uneasy space between what must have happened in some form and what cannot yet be fully reconstructed. This is where certainty begins to loosen. If the Black Sea water level rose over land once occupied by people, then loss is almost certain in the broad sense. Homes would have been abandoned, camps or villages would have disappeared. Fishing grounds and river edge routes would have changed. Some people would have moved. Some would have rebuilt elsewhere. Some may have seen their old landmarks swallowed. What is much harder to know is whether this happened as a long retreat over generations or as something more violent and compressed. That single difference changes the emotional center of the story. A slower rise does not make the loss small. It only changes its rhythm. In that version, an elder might remember a childhood path now under shallow water. A family might relocate piece by piece, carrying goods inland as the shoreline crept toward them. Graves might be left behind one by one. A generation might speak of the old shore, the way later people spoke of old roads or abandoned orchards. The trauma would still be real. It would simply be stretched across time, absorbed into migration, adaptation, and resignation. A sharper flooding event creates a different human picture. In that version, change outruns custom. Water crosses into places not prepared for it. Wet ground becomes open water. River mouths widen. Safe distances vanish. Boats become necessities. Panic becomes more plausible. Counting the dead becomes impossible, not because no one died, but because the society that might have counted them had no written system robust enough to preserve a tally, and the land that held the evidence went under. This is why the phrase, "nobody knows how many people drowned," has such force. It does not merely signal missing data. It signals the gap between physical catastrophe and historical record. If a medieval town burns, later documents may preserve its losses. If a Roman army is defeated, some chronicler will often exaggerate or minimize the dead, but at least numbers enter the record. Prehistoric coasts have no such protection. Their tragedies vanish into geology. And still, caution is needed. The absence of account does not give permission for fantasy. The number could have been modest in one locality and larger across a long period. Some groups may have escaped entirely. Others may have relocated long before the water became fatal. The image of whole populations being overtaken in a single moment is possible in the imagination, but the evidence for exact scenarios remains thin. The honest version of the story is more difficult and, in a way, more haunting. We are dealing with a loss that feels human and large, yet refuses to settle into a number. The challenge for historians and archaeologists is that human lives do not survive equally. Stone survives better than wood. Deep water wrecks survive better than woven mats on open ground. Elite societies often leave more visible traces than humble ones. Prehistoric fisher farmers living in light structures near shifting coasts may have left just enough to suggest themselves, but not enough to speak clearly without help from geology and patient interpretation. That means the first voices we hear in this story are often not human voices at all. They are shorelines, sediment bands, changes in shell species, underwater contours, ancient river channels, buried surfaces. These are the grammar of the drowned landscape. Before the Black Sea yields names, it yields forms. Yet those forms carry a distinctly human pressure. A buried beach asks who stood there. A drowned valley asks who followed it. A submerged shelf asks whether fires once burned on its edge. Even when evidence of direct habitation is sparse or disputed, the very shape of the lost land acts like an invitation. People lived where water and land met. They did so again and again across prehistory because shorelines offered fish, birds, reeds, transport, fresh water nearby, fertile soils in some regions, and routes between zones of life. The margin between land and water is one of the oldest human preferences on Earth. So the question is not only whether the Black Sea once covered less area, the question is whether the now drowned margins were part of that same long human pattern. It would be surprising if they were not. What remains uncertain is how dense the settlement was, how permanent it was, how socially complex it was, and how the people who lived there experienced the changes that followed. Picture a settlement that does not know it will become a theory. A line of dwellings near a low shore, smoke lifting into cool air, nets drying, fish bones and broken shells collecting near work areas. Children tracing routes adults have taken for years. A boat pushed into water that seems ordinary. No one there would think they were standing inside a future argument among marine geologists, archaeologists, and historians. They would think they were standing where people stand, near food, near family, near what is familiar. And perhaps that is the deepest sadness built into drowned prehistory. People do not usually know when their ordinary world is becoming unrecoverable. The last generation to live on a coast may not realize that the coast itself is about to cease to exist as a place of return. Many historical mysteries lose force when they remain unresolved for too long. The lack of answers makes them feel thin. The Black Sea mystery does something different. Its uncertainty is part of what keeps it alive. There is enough evidence to suggest real transformation. Enough geography to make the scenario plausible. Enough archaeological promise to keep searching. Enough debate to prevent the whole story from hardening into something simple and overconfident. That mix is unusually durable. It also touches one of the oldest human fears in a calm but powerful way. Not the fear of battle, but the fear of losing ground itself. Land feels stable until it no longer is. Shorelines feel trustworthy until they begin to move. A home can survive enemies, storms, even hunger for a time. It cannot remain a home once the world under it changes into water. Modern people understand this more easily now than they once did. We know coasts are not permanent. We know seas rise and fall across long spans of time. We know storms redraw edges overnight. But modern measurement can also dull the emotional reality. When everything becomes data, it becomes easier to miss what the data means. The Black Sea returns that feeling. It turns a change in basin level back into a human question. That is why the image of an entire country beneath the sea, though imperfect, continues to grip the imagination. It captures scale, loss, and silence all at once. The drowned place beneath the Black Sea was not empty. It may not have been a kingdom. It may not have had walls or a throne or a name we would recognize. But it may have been large enough, lived enough, and coherent enough in human terms to deserve that older word, country. A country of shore camps and villages. A country of shallow inlets and river mouths. A country of routine. A country of people who expected tomorrow to resemble yesterday. If that is even partly true, then the Black Sea did not merely flood land, it covered belonging. By now, the sea floor beneath the Black Sea no longer feels like a blank surface. It feels layered. Under the present water lies an older coast. Under the coast lies the possibility of settlement. Under the settlement lies the question of how change arrived. All of those layers matter, because the next step in this story is the hardest one to imagine without rushing too quickly toward drama. Water level rise is simple to say and difficult to feel. It is measured in meters and centuries, in thresholds and basin exchange, in sediment and shell evidence. Yet to the people who may have lived near those old shores, it would have been experienced as a rearrangement of life itself. A path grows wet. A landing place becomes unreliable. Fish patterns shift. A familiar flat stretch of shore narrows. Fresh water tastes different in one place and not in another. Marsh turns to open water. A journey once made on foot now needs a boat. The old markers stop making sense. Whether that change came quickly or over many generations is one of the great arguments surrounding the Black Sea. But before the argument can even begin, one fact must be faced. The land beneath the sea today was once closer to human reach than it is now. Somewhere between the older shore and the modern surface lies the story of how that reach was broken. And once we start following that break, the question becomes larger than one flooded coast. It becomes a question about thresholds, about the narrow passages that connect seas, about meltwater and rising oceans, about whether one basin can suddenly change the fate of the people living around it. The quiet floor beneath the Black Sea is only the first clue. The real motion of the story begins when we ask what pushed the water across the boundary, and whether the drowning of that lost country happened like a slow surrender or like a door forced open. That is where the sea grows more difficult, and where the old shoreline in the dark begins to lead us toward the moment when the world itself may have started to fill. Long before anyone gave the Black Sea its modern name, before Greek colonies ringed its edges, before Roman merchants crossed it, before medieval ports watched its storms, it existed as a basin with a different relationship to water than it has now. That is the first shift we have to make in the mind. We are used to seeing the Black Sea as a fixed feature of the map, a large dark inland sea linked to the Mediterranean through the Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles. We inherit its outline as though it had always been waiting there in its current form. But ancient basins are rarely so obedient. They change with climate, with ice, with river flow, with the opening and closing of narrow passages, and with differences in level that may seem small on a map, but enormous on a human shore. At the end of the last ice age, the lands around the Black Sea belonged to a world already in motion. Great ice sheets that had once locked away massive volumes of water were shrinking. Temperatures were climbing. Glaciers were retreating. Rivers fed by meltwater were changing in power and pattern. Across the planet, coastlines were adjusting to the long release of water from ice into the sea. Some changes were slow enough to be absorbed over generations. Others came in pulses. The human populations living through that transition did not experience it as an abstract climate chapter. They experienced it as weather, mud, floodplain, marsh, drought, shoreline, fish, movement, difficulty, opportunity, and loss. The Black Sea Basin sat in the middle of that larger reordering. Its fate was tied not only to local rivers and rainfall, but also to the wider sea world beyond the narrow straits that today connect it to the Mediterranean. That larger sea world was rising. The question that has fascinated generations of researchers is not whether post-Ice Age sea level rise was real. That much is settled. The question is how that rise affected the Black Sea Basin in particular. Was it a gradual filling, an uneven adjustment, a dramatic breakthrough, or some combination of those things at different times and places? The old shorelines below the modern surface suggest that the basin was once lower, at least in relation to the water level we know today. There were ancient margins where land reached farther. There were river valleys that crossed space now buried beneath water. There were lower shelves available to plants, animals, and people. A coast is not just a line, it is a whole zone of life. When that zone moves, everything living in relation to it must move too. So when we say the Black Sea was not yet the Black Sea, we do not mean it was empty. We mean it was a different hydrological world. Its water may at times have been fresher. Its outline was different. Its edges reached elsewhere. The land around it interacted with it under different conditions. To anyone living along its lower shores, the geography of daily life would not have matched any modern map. That is what makes the story so unsettling in a quiet way. The present sea conceals not one clean earlier version of itself, but a sequence of changing states. There was no single eternal Black Sea waiting to emerge. There was a basin moving through time, and at some stage in that motion, a threshold was crossed. It helps to think of the end of the Ice Age as the slow return of withheld water. For thousands of years, so much of the planet's water had been stored in continental ice that sea levels were far lower than they are now. The world's coastlines were different almost everywhere. Broad continental shelves lay exposed. Plains connected regions that are now separated by water. Rivers ran across land now hidden under shallow seas. Human beings living during those periods often had access to coastal and lowland worlds that later vanished completely. When the ice began to melt, sea level did not rise in a perfectly smooth line. There were pauses, faster phases, local complications, and the added difficulty of land surfaces themselves adjusting after the immense pressure of ice was removed. Even so, the overall direction was clear. Water was returning to the oceans. Shorelines across the world were creeping, jumping, and reshaping. No generation living near a low coast could have assumed that the shoreline they knew had always been there, though they had no way of seeing the entire global pattern. They would have known only what happened in their own remembered landscapes. The Black Sea Basin was one of the places where this larger process met a local structure capable of magnifying its effects. Picture a bowl partly isolated from the wider sea, fed by many rivers, sensitive to any change in outside connection. If the level outside the bowl rose high enough, and if the connection between them permitted exchange, the balance inside could change dramatically. This is why narrow passages matter so much in the Black Sea story. The Bosporus is not large on a world map, yet the fate of a vast basin can turn on a narrow place. The important thing is not to imagine ancient people sitting around watching a scientific event called post-glacial marine transgression. They would not have known such language. What they would have known was that the boundaries they trusted were less permanent than they seemed. Marshes might shift, river mouths might widen, freshwater zones might change taste or behavior. Certain fish might appear or disappear. Low ground might become unreliable. Shores that had once been safe for settlement might begin to threaten it. These signs would not necessarily announce catastrophe. In many places, people are remarkably good at adapting to gradual environmental change. They relocate camp by camp, generation by generation. They move fields, alter fishing habits, follow resources, and revise routes. Human flexibility is one reason prehistoric populations survived so much climatic instability. But flexibility has limits. There comes a point at which adaptation becomes abandonment. There comes a point at which a landscape that used to support life becomes a memory of support instead. This is one reason the Black Sea story lingers. It belongs to a universal human pattern. It is regional in detail, but global in meaning. The whole early Holocene world contained communities adjusting to moving water. What makes the Black Sea special is the scale of the basin and the possibility that a narrow connection helped turn gradual global change into a more concentrated local transformation. If the Black Sea mystery has a single dramatic setting, it is the Bosporus. Today, this narrow strait runs through Istanbul, crowded with ships, bridges, neighborhoods, lights, and constant motion. It feels inseparable from human civilization because cities have grown around it for so long. But in the deeper past, before cities, before empires, before recorded history in that region, it was still what it is in physical terms, a threshold between one water world and another. Thresholds are powerful places in history. A mountain pass can change trade. A river crossing can determine war. A strait can alter ecology, economy, migration, and settlement. The Bosporus had the potential to do all of those things through the simple but immense question of connection. Was the Black Sea Basin fully linked to the Mediterranean system at the same level as today? Was it more isolated? When outside waters rose, did they eventually spill through in a way that transformed the basin? If so, how quickly, how forcefully, and when? These questions became famous in part because of the deluge hypothesis proposed in the late 20th century. In its strongest popular form, The idea suggested that Mediterranean waters broke through into a much lower Black Sea basin in a catastrophic flood, perhaps with enough force and speed to overwhelm human communities and leave a deep cultural memory. That version captured public imagination immediately. It had scale, drama, and a setting ancient enough to feel almost mythic. It seemed to offer something rare, a geological event dramatic enough to sit behind later flood stories. But public fascination can make a theory feel simpler than it is. The core scientific issue is not just whether there was flooding. Of course there was change. The real difficulty lies in reconstructing the timing, the level difference, the rate of inflow, and the exact shape of the basin during key moments. Geological records are powerful, but they do not speak in one voice. Sediment cores, shoreline evidence, microfossils, shell data, and regional comparisons can suggest different interpretations depending on how they are read together. That is why the Bosporus in this story should not be treated as a single theatrical doorway suddenly flung open in a neat instant. It may have been the site of repeated changes in connection over long spans. It may have mediated a transformation more complex than either total catastrophe or complete gradualism alone can express. The basin could have experienced periods of isolation, reconnection, varying salinity, and uneven rise. Nature often refuses the clean, all-or-nothing pictures that human storytelling prefers. Yet the image remains powerful for a reason. If a lower Black Sea basin existed, while the Mediterranean world outside was rising, then the Bosporus becomes the place where one level met another. On one side, the pressure of a higher sea. On the other, a lower basin with its own coastlines, wetlands, and human margins. However the transition unfolded, it would have mattered enormously to anyone living around the lower shores. A threshold crossed in a narrow strait can erase a great deal of familiar land far beyond that strait itself. One of the quieter but most important questions in the Black Sea debate concerns the character of the basin itself before the modern marine connection took hold. Was it largely fresh, brackish, already somewhat marine? The answer matters because it changes the ecology, the fish species, the human use of the shores, and the interpretation of geological evidence. It also changes how we imagine daily life around the ancient basin. A largely freshwater or brackish Black Sea would not have been simply a smaller version of the modern one. It would have been a different environment. The species available to fishers might have been different. The margins where reeds and marshes grew could have supported different birds, plants, and patterns of settlement. River inflow would have mattered even more. Seasonal rhythms might have shaped movement along the shore in ways distinct from those of a more fully marine sea. For ancient communities, these differences were not technical details. They were the structure of daily possibility. A certain fish run can support one kind of life. Salinity shifts can alter that. Wetlands rich in birds and reeds can anchor one set of seasonal tasks. A drowned wetland becomes open water and erases those habits. The larger the environmental change, the more fully daily life has to be reinvented. Researchers studying the basin have looked closely at shells and sediments because they can help indicate changes in salinity and water exchange. Shell species may suggest one kind of environment at one time and another later. Sediment layers can preserve clues about changing water conditions. None of this produces a simple narrative on its own. But together, these traces allow scientists to approach the Black Sea not as a single unchanging body, but as a place with a history written in transitions. This is another reason the title image of a lost country works better than it first seems. A country in the old human sense is not merely landmass. It is a pattern of life fitted to land and water together. If the Black Sea Basin once held a different water regime, then the people living around it were fitted to that older pattern. They knew where to fish, where to land, where fresh water could be relied upon, where marsh ended and solid ground began, where seasonal abundance could be found, and which routes connected one useful place to another. When the sea changed, their country changed, even if no one called it that. We often imagine ancient environmental shifts only in terms of dramatic endings, but a changing sea also means practical confusion. Old knowledge becomes partly wrong. A landing place silts up or disappears. A useful inlet turns uncertain. A marsh path becomes dangerous. A shoreline resource is lost. These are small things when viewed one at a time. Together, they amount to the dismantling of a world. And because the change in the Black Sea may have involved not just rising level but changing water character, it would not have been simply the sea moving inland. It would have been one kind of sea becoming another, and one human adaptation slowly or quickly losing its footing. There are, in broad terms, two ways people tend to imagine what happened to the lower shores of the ancient Black Sea. The first is the dramatic version. In this picture, the basin lay far below Mediterranean level, and at some critical point, water rushed through the Bosporus with tremendous force, pouring into the lower basin, expanding the sea rapidly, and overwhelming coastlines on a timescale close enough to human shock that the event might have lodged itself in memory. This version is vivid. It is easy to picture. It gives the story a terrible momentum. The second version is slower and less theatrical. In that picture, the Black Sea rose through a more complex and extended process, perhaps involving periods of connection and gradual adjustment, with regional and local differences. The water still advanced over older coasts, land still disappeared, settlements still may have been abandoned or shifted, but the process may not have resembled a single sudden wall of destruction. Instead, it may have been long, uneven, and difficult to reduce to one dramatic moment. The reason this distinction matters is not just scientific precision. It is human meaning. A sudden event produces fear, immediate drowning, abrupt displacement, and memories centered on shock. A slower event produces retreat, adaptation, resettlement, and memories centered on loss of place rather than a single day of terror. Both can be devastating. They simply leave different kinds of scars. It is possible that the real history contains elements of both, depending on when and where one looks. Some areas may have experienced relatively sharp changes. Others may have faced slower encroachment. Certain thresholds may have been crossed in dramatic fashion, even if the total basin history was not a single catastrophe. Human communities could have faced a patchwork of experiences, a frightening year here, a difficult generation there, a long erosion of certainty elsewhere. This mixed possibility is less satisfying to the part of the mind that wants one clear answer, but it may be closer to how environmental history usually works. Real landscapes do not always arrange themselves to suit narrative simplicity. They change in bursts and drifts, through systems interacting over time. A family in one settlement might remember a sudden inundation of familiar low ground. Another group 50 miles away might remember only that the shoreline of their grandparents had once been farther out. If that was the case, then counting victims becomes not just difficult, but impossible in principle. The losses would be distributed across time, space, and mode. Some deaths could have been immediate drownings. Others could have come through displacement, scarcity, conflict, or the vulnerability that follows rapid environmental change. Some communities may have escaped with little direct loss of life but deep loss of place. Others may not have escaped in time. The Black Sea keeps that arithmetic to itself. To make sense of this ancient transition, it helps to leave theory for a moment and return to the human scale. Imagine you live near a broad, low shore at the edge of the basin. The land is not monumental. It is practical. There are fishing places, patches of good ground, shallow reeds, a place to pull up a boat, a track to slightly higher land, a freshwater source known to your group, perhaps nearby fields if farming has already become part of life in your community, perhaps herds moved between seasonal grounds. At first, the changes might seem manageable. Water lingers in places where it used to withdraw. A stretch of low shore that once dried fully stays wet later into the season. One path becomes troublesome after storms. The edge of the marsh creeps outward. The mouth of a stream behaves oddly. Old men argue about whether the shore looked different in their youth. Some think memory exaggerates. Others insist it does not. Then the evidence becomes harder to dismiss. A work area has to be moved. A boat landing is less reliable. Fish appear in a new pattern. A place where children once walked now needs caution. Some families shift their shelters slightly higher. Some refuse. A burial ground becomes vulnerable. One year a storm reaches farther than anyone expected. Another year, what looked temporary does not reverse. None of this requires a single catastrophic day to become painful. A rising shore attacks continuity. It does not only take land, it takes confidence. It weakens knowledge, handed down as practical truth. The world stops behaving the way it used to. A line that mattered becomes uncertain. Now imagine that on top of this creeping instability, there is also a stronger hydrological reordering of the basin. Water character changes, salinity shifts, old fish habits alter, wetlands transform. Navigation changes, an inlet deepens, a river mouth expands. Suddenly the problem is no longer one family moving uphill. The whole local system of living is being altered. In that kind of setting, migration begins long before archaeologists can prove it. People do not wait for complete understanding. They move when the balance of staying turns against them. Some leave early. Some stay too long. Some return to check what has changed. Some attempt to rebuild in places that later also become uncertain. The lost country beneath the Black Sea, if we call it that, may not have vanished in one motion. It may have unraveled as countless decisions made under pressure, each one reasonable in itself, together amounting to the abandonment of a world. That is a very different image from a cinematic flood sweeping all before it, and in some ways it is sadder. Sudden disaster is terrifying. Slow surrender can be intimate. It keeps people close enough to watch what they are losing. The debate over the Black Sea's transformation has lasted so long because the evidence is real but not complete, and because different kinds of evidence speak at different scales. Geologists may focus on basin levels, sediments, shorelines, and marine indicators. Archaeologists look for settlement traces, artifacts, and patterns of human occupation. Paleoenvironments are reconstructed from shells, pollen, microfossils, and cores. Each source of information is valuable. None provides the whole story alone. This means arguments arise not only from disagreement over facts, but from disagreement over emphasis. One researcher may see a set of data as pointing toward a dramatic inflow. Another may see the same region as more consistent with phased reconnection and gradual change. A shoreline marker may look decisive until it is placed beside new dating evidence. A shell assemblage may suggest one salinity history until other local factors complicate it. The Black Sea resists being reduced to a single clean diagram. For the listener settling into this history at night, this may sound frustrating, but uncertainty here is not a weakness in the story. It is part of what makes the story honest. The past is often most powerful where it refuses to flatten. If every feature lined up perfectly, the Black Sea would become simpler, but also less real. Real ancient landscapes were complicated, and ancient humans lived through changes without the benefit of summary conclusions. The deeper truth beneath the argument is still compelling. Whether the flooding was abrupt, gradual, or mixed in different phases, lower landscapes around the Black Sea were lost beneath later waters. This much is enough to sustain the haunting image at the center of the title. Somewhere under the present sea are surfaces once open to sky. Somewhere beneath later sediments are places where people may have stood with no notion that their shore would someday exist only as a submerged puzzle. The argument matters because it shapes our understanding of how those people suffered, moved, adapted, or died. But even the argument cannot erase the drowned geography itself. It remains there as a stubborn fact of the basin's history. The precise drama may be contested. The loss of land is not. One of the most tempting ideas associated with the Black Sea flooding is that it might help explain later flood stories. This is an alluring possibility because it links physical change to cultural memory. If human communities around the basin experienced severe inundation, perhaps tales of overwhelming water survived in oral tradition, traveled with migrants, and eventually fed into wider mythic patterns in the ancient Near East and beyond. It is an attractive thought, but it must be handled carefully. Flood stories are common in many cultures for many reasons. Rivers flood, coasts storm, memory condenses different events, symbolism grows. A single geological episode cannot be used carelessly as a master key for every tale of destruction by water. Even so, the Black Sea remains one of the few places where a large-scale prehistoric flooding event seems plausible enough to keep the question alive. What matters most here is not whether one can prove a direct line from ancient inundation to famous later texts. That may always remain uncertain. What matters is the principle that memory does not require writing in order to survive. People carry memory in routes, warnings, rituals, place names, prohibitions, and stories told to the young. They remember where the old shore used to be. They tell of the year water came too far. They recall a village left behind. Over generations, detail fades and meaning remains. If the Black Sea shores were transformed in a way that dislocated communities, then some form of water memory is entirely plausible. A people who leave behind drowned ground do not forget water easily. Even when precise geography is lost, emotional truth can remain. Water crossed a boundary it should not have crossed. Familiar land was taken. The world became less stable than it had seemed. That kind of memory can travel far even when names and dates do not. In this sense, the Black Sea story sits between geology and folklore. The seafloor holds one kind of record. Human storytelling may have held another, looser and less verifiable but still meaningful. The two do not have to align perfectly to belong to the same ancient emotional landscape. And perhaps that is part of why the story feels so old even now. It touches a zone of memory deeper than history books. It speaks to a time when people had to read the world directly because there was nothing else to rely on. When the world changed, memory was the only archive they could carry with them. Once we begin to picture the ancient Black Sea as a changing basin rather than a fixed sea, the consequences spread outward in every direction. Ecology changes. Human settlement changes. Routes of travel change. Patterns of exchange may change. The very meaning of the shoreline changes. A coast is not just a boundary. It is a meeting place. When it moves, relationships move with it. This is why the story cannot remain only geological. Even the most careful sediment study eventually points back toward human adaptation. A coastline lost under later water is not merely a contour gone from the map. It is labor rearranged, food sources reevaluated, movement disrupted, homes rebuilt, and old places abandoned. If farming communities were already present in parts of the wider region, then arable lowlands and settlement choices would also have been implicated. If more mobile fishing groups used those margins seasonally, their circuits of return would have been altered or broken. The pace of the transition still matters, but either way, the basin's filling becomes a history of consequence. Fast water punishes suddenly, slow water punishes repeatedly. One kills through shock. The other kills through dislocation. Both force decisions. Both leave some people behind. And still, because this happened before written record in the relevant communities, most of those decisions are invisible to us. We do not know the names of the families that may have moved first. We do not know who stayed to guard storage pits or who refused to leave a burial place. We do not know whether groups around the basin argued over whether the changes were temporary. We do not know what children were told when the old route could no longer be walked. The silence of those lives is part of what makes the whole subject so difficult to leave behind. Beneath the modern Black Sea, there may be no single lost kingdom waiting to be outlined in stone. There may instead be something more human and more elusive, many fragments of ordinary worlds overtaken by environmental change. A country not in the political sense, but in the sense of belonging spread across a landscape, a world of use, return, and recognition, a world large enough to matter, fragile enough to disappear. By the end of this second movement in the story, the Black Sea has become less like a map feature and more like a question posed by a basin. It asks what happens when withheld water returns. It asks what a narrow threshold can do to a wide, inhabited margin. It asks whether the people living around its earlier shores saw the danger coming or merely lived inside it without a full picture. It asks whether the transformation came like a blow, a slow pressure, or both, depending on where one stood. We can now feel the scale of the physical change more clearly. The old shores are no longer just a haunting image in darkness. They belong to a world remade by climate, meltwater, and connection between seas. The Bosporus has become more than a strait. It has become the narrow place where local human life may have met a vast planetary change. The arguments over flood speed and basin history remain unresolved in detail, but the human stakes have sharpened. Because once the water begins to move in this story, another question rises with it. If lower landscapes existed around the basin, who lived there in the centuries before they vanished beneath later waters? Were they small seasonal groups, settled fisher farmers, early village communities, or some combination of all three? What did they build? What did they eat? What traces did they leave behind? And if the land beneath the Black Sea really was part of an inhabited world, then the lost shores were not just geological features, they were home. That is where the seafloor stops being only a record of changing water and starts becoming a search for people. Once a coastline is imagined clearly enough, people begin to appear almost on their own. That is the natural next step in the Black Sea story. After all, a lower shore is not simply a geological feature. It is an invitation to settlement. It offers fish, reeds, birds, shellfish, routes of movement, access to fresh water from rivers and streams, workable ground in certain zones, and the kind of edgeland that human beings have favored for an extraordinarily long time. Wherever land meets water in a reliable way, people tend to gather sooner or later. Some come seasonally. Some remain. Some learn the rhythms so well that the shoreline becomes part of their memory of the world itself. So the question now is not only how the Black Sea changed, but who may have been living near those now drowned margins before the water rose over them. There is no surviving census, no written list of settlements, no official account of disappearance. There is not even a single agreed image of the communities involved. What we have instead is a larger historical landscape to work from. Around the Black Sea region, during the long span between the end of the Ice Age and the spread of settled farming societies, human life was already varied, adaptive, and deeply tied to local environments. People hunted, fished, gathered, moved seasonally, built temporary or semi-permanent dwellings, and in later periods began tending crops and keeping animals in more settled ways. That means the lost land beneath the Black Sea should not be imagined as empty ground waiting for civilization to arrive. It belonged to a world already full of human experimentation. Some communities would have been more mobile, others more rooted. Some may have returned to the same camps year after year, building familiarity without creating anything like a city. Others may have begun to form village life, with repeated occupation of the same favorable places. The old shoreline could have hosted many kinds of human existence at once. This is one reason the phrase "entire country" remains useful, even though it is not literally exact. It helps the mind picture not a single drowned settlement, but a broad inhabited zone. A country in this sense is not a state. It is a lived region made coherent by habit. Fishers know its inlets. Gatherers know its seasonal plants. Boat users know where to land. Families know which stretches are safe in certain weather. Children grow up measuring distance, not with maps, but with remembered turns in the land. A whole people can belong to such a place without ever building monuments large enough to survive underwater for millennia. And that is the quiet difficulty of the Black Sea. The people most likely to have lived on its vulnerable prehistoric margins are also the people least likely to leave bold traces that endure. Their existence would have been real, daily, and embodied. Their archaeological visibility may be faint. It is easy to speak romantically about coasts, but prehistoric people did not choose them because they looked beautiful at sunset. They chose them because they worked. A shoreline gives access to more than one environment at once. Water offers fish, transport, and birds. Nearby land may offer game, edible plants, wood, clay, and higher ground for shelter. Wetlands can be difficult, but they can also be rich. Estuaries and river mouths are especially valuable because they bring together fresh and salt or brackish conditions in ways that multiply resources. The lower margins of the ancient Black Sea basin would have offered exactly this kind of combined opportunity. Picture wide flats crossed by rivers, inlets where fish concentrate, marshy zones thick with reeds, slightly higher ground suitable for camp or village, and routes that allow movement between coast and interior. Such spaces are attractive because they make life more flexible. A community can fish in one season, gather in another, travel inland when needed, and return when conditions improve. The shoreline is not just a destination, it is a system. For prehistoric groups, this flexibility mattered. Life was never fully secure. Weather changed, animal patterns shifted, water levels altered access, tools broke, illness came. A good landscape was one that offered options. The ancient Black Sea margin may have been exactly that kind of place for long stretches of time. Not easy in every season, not safe in every year, but rich enough to keep drawing people back. This is important because it changes how we imagine the people who may have been displaced. They were not necessarily passive victims, waiting in one fixed spot for catastrophe to strike. They were likely observant, skilled, and deeply knowledgeable about land and water. They knew how to read weather, track animals, manage nets or traps, repair tools, and move when necessary. If later farming communities were already established in parts of the region, they also knew planting, storage, animal care, and the routines of a more settled life. In either case, they were not helpless. And yet, skill does not cancel vulnerability. A people can be highly adapted to a place and still be broken by a transformation large enough to make that adaptation obsolete. In fact, the better fitted a community is to a specific landscape, the more disruptive it is when that landscape changes beyond recognition. Knowledge turns suddenly partial, experience becomes less reliable. The trusted edge between land and water begins to shift. What once sustained life becomes uncertain. That is why the drowned margins of the Black Sea feel so emotionally charged. They invite us to imagine not merely lives ended, but knowledge defeated. A way of living can disappear even when people survive. One mistake modern imagination often makes is to divide ancient people too neatly into categories. We picture hunter-gatherers as always mobile and farmers as fully settled, as though the world changed all at once from wandering to village life. Real prehistory was more complicated. Many groups lived somewhere in between, moving seasonally but returning to favored places. Others built more permanent homes while still relying on fishing, hunting, and gathering to a significant degree. Still others practiced early farming without instantly transforming every part of life into a rigid, settled pattern. The ancient Black Sea margins may have hosted exactly this kind of mixed world. Some sites could have been seasonal camps, used during fish runs or bird migrations. Others may have been repeatedly occupied settlements where families stayed for long periods. Still, others may have shifted between these roles depending on the year, the water, and the needs of the people involved. A coastline is good at producing this kind of social variety because it offers both movement and return. Imagine a low shoreline where one group erects light shelters during part of the year, drying fish and mending nets before moving inland again. Not far away, another community may remain longer in one place, with storage pits, hearths, heavier structures, perhaps a few domesticated animals, perhaps gardens on slightly higher ground. Neither community would look like a city, neither would leave behind a skyline of ruins, but both would be fully human worlds with memory, obligation, danger, skill, and attachment. This matters because when water later covers such places, the archaeological traces do not necessarily announce themselves loudly. A seasonal camp may leave scattered tools, fire-altered soil, bones, shells, and faint structural evidence. A modest village may leave pottery fragments, post holes, floors, pits, and the layered refuse of everyday life. Under later sediments and underwater conditions, some of this may survive. Some may disperse. Some may remain recognizable only if excavated under the right circumstances with unusual patience. So the drowned country beneath the Black Sea may not be one thing. It may be a patchwork of human presence, small return sites, reused camps, fishing stations, family settlements, wetland edge work areas, places for burying the dead, routes followed for generations, shallow water landing places, tiny clusters of huts, larger but still fragile villages. A human geography made of repeated use rather than formal boundaries. And because such a geography is woven from repetition, not from stone monuments, it is also especially vulnerable to disappearance. Once the repeated use stops, and once water claims the ground, the logic of the place fades quickly from sight. Only traces remain, and traces require interpretation. If we stay close to what is plausible rather than what is theatrical, the people on the lost Black Sea margins begin to look less like legendary figures and more like families. That is useful. It keeps the story human. A prehistoric shoreline settlement would not have felt mysterious to the people living there. It would have felt ordinary. The mystery belongs to us because we see the place only through loss. Mourning near such a settlement might begin with simple tasks: nets checked, fish cleaned, embers stirred back to life, water collected, children watched. Small repairs made to baskets, cord, or simple wooden tools. If animals were being kept, they would need attention. If cultivation was practiced nearby, the ground would need watching. Seasonal rhythms would structure labor more strongly than clocks ever could. Certain times of year would bring abundance, others would demand caution and planning. Food would likely come from multiple sources: fish and shellfish if available, birds from wetland zones, wild plants and gathered foods, game from nearby land, perhaps grain or other cultivated crops in later prehistoric phases, depending on region and date. Diet would not have been identical across the whole ancient shoreline. Communities adapt locally. One inlet may support one pattern of subsistence, another something different. The broader point is that the old Black Sea margins likely supported mixed economies, and mixed economies can support resilient communities. Housing would probably have varied too. Some shelters may have been light and seasonally maintained, others more durable, built to endure repeated occupation. Materials would depend on what the local environment provided: wood, reeds, mud, brush, hides, woven coverings. None of this sounds grand, but that is exactly the point. Human life is usually built from available matter. A whole world can exist in materials that later leave only faint stains in the ground. There would also have been something less visible but just as important: social memory. Who belongs where? Which families return to which places? Which routes are safe? Which shoals are dangerous? Where elders are buried? Which waters are trusted in one season but not another? These are not decorative details. They are the real fabric of belonging. They are what turn usable ground into home. And once water begins to shift the rules, this invisible fabric strains before the physical structures do. A hut can be rebuilt. A hearth can be moved. But what does it mean when the place your people know begins to act differently than before? What does it mean when the old knowledge still partly works, but not enough? That is a harder kind of damage to measure. The wider region around the Black Sea was not isolated from one of the largest transformations in human history: the spread of farming and more settled village life. Over many centuries, crops, domestic animals, and new ways of organizing daily labor moved through adjoining regions. This did not happen all at once, and it did not replace older lifeways immediately. Instead, practices overlapped, blended, and spread unevenly. Some communities adopted cultivation but still relied heavily on fishing or hunting. Others resisted change longer. Some incorporated domestic animals into still mobile systems of movement. The result was not a single clean revolution, but a broad shifting zone of transition. This matters because the possible communities living along the lower Black Sea margins during key phases of rising water may have belonged to this changing world. Some may have been early farmers. Some may have interacted with farming neighbors without fully becoming like them. Some may have used pottery, stored grain, and occupied more durable settlements. Others may have remained highly seasonal. The lost land beneath the sea may therefore contain not only traces of one social type, but evidence of a time when human life itself was becoming more settled, more rooted, and perhaps more vulnerable to the loss of place. A people who move lightly can retreat more easily, though not without pain. A people who have invested labor in fields, storage, enclosures, and repeated house building may find retreat much harder. The more work a community has sunk into one landscape, the more devastating it is when that landscape begins to fail. Water does not only take space, it takes stored labor, it takes built memory. It takes plans for the next season. This is one reason the Black Sea can feel almost unbearably poignant when placed in the early agricultural era. If rising waters reached communities already experimenting with settled life, then the drowning of lowlands may have interrupted more than subsistence. It may have interrupted a new way of relating to time itself. Planting assumes return. Storage assumes continuity. Domestic space assumes the future will still belong to the same ground. A rising shore makes those assumptions dangerous. It may also have pushed people outward. If communities displaced from the lost margins moved inland or along new coasts, they may have carried skills, crops, animals, stories, and tensions with them. They would not have arrived as blank wanderers. They would have arrived as people from somewhere, even if that somewhere was already half gone. Migration in prehistory was not only movement of bodies, it was movement of habits. And so the old drowned landscape beneath the Black Sea may have mattered beyond its own shore. The people who left it may have influenced other regions without anyone later knowing why they moved when they did. Whenever a prehistoric shoreline is discussed, there is a risk of imagining people as trapped against the water, as though the sea was only a threat or a barrier. But water is also a route. Coasts do not merely confine human beings, they connect them. Even simple boats, rafts, or dugouts can transform what a shore means. A stretch of water that seems isolating from one perspective may be a road from another. This matters greatly for the ancient Black Sea margins. Communities living near a lower basin shoreline may not have experienced the coast as an edge of the world. They may have experienced it as a corridor of travel. Fishers, traders in small goods, kin groups, seasonal movers, or neighboring communities could have followed waterways and coastlines as practical lines of connection. The sea itself, or the estuarine and river systems tied to it, may have brought people together across wider spaces than the modern eye first imagines. That means a drowned shoreline is not only the loss of settlements, it is also the loss of routes. Landing points disappear, familiar crossing places deepen, wetland passages alter. A once usable bay becomes open water. A line of movement that linked families or exchange partners is broken. The damage is social as well as physical. Boats also complicate the question of drowning. If water rose and people had watercraft, some communities may have escaped direct disaster more easily than we assume. A people used to moving on water can respond differently to change than a purely inland population. Yet this does not reduce the scale of disruption. Boats can save lives in a fast crisis, but they cannot preserve a vanished home, nor can they carry everything. Fields cannot be loaded into a canoe. Burial places cannot be floated away. Knowledge tied to one exact shore does not transfer perfectly to another. There is also a quieter possibility. Communities deeply familiar with boats and coastlines may have observed the changes more carefully than we would expect. They may have noticed shifting channels, odd currents, altered fish patterns, new depths at old landing places. In that sense, the first witnesses to the drowning of the lost Black Sea margins may have been skilled water people reading signs before anyone else. That does not mean they could stop what was coming. It only means they may have understood the danger in practical terms sooner than later imagination gives them credit for. So the old coast beneath the sea was probably not a static strip of passive settlements. It was a lived edge, full of motion, repeated journeys, and working knowledge. When it vanished, a network vanished with it. To picture a prehistoric drowned world only through adults is to miss something essential. Every lost landscape is also the loss of a childhood world. Children are the ones who learn a place most intimately, because they learn it before it becomes abstract. They know which patch of ground stays soft after rain, where reeds grow thickest, where crabs or fish can be seen in shallow water, where elders tell them not to go, which path feels safe, which bend in the shoreline means home is near. A changing coast would therefore be experienced by children differently than by adults. Adults would notice labor, risk, and resource change. Children would notice that the familiar world had shifted its shape. A path is gone. A sand or mud flat is covered. An inlet looks larger. A place once used for play is forbidden. A parent's voice carries a new sharpness when the water is mentioned. This matters because when we ask how many people drowned, we are not asking only about anonymous prehistoric bodies. We are also asking about lost generations whose world may have changed before they were old enough to understand why. Some may have survived and grown up with stories of the old shore. Others may have been carried away in migration. Others may have been among those taken by sudden inundation, if such events occurred. The emotional power of the unknown number lies partly in this simple fact. Among the uncounted were certainly children. It also reminds us that memory of the drowned land, if it survived in oral form, may have been shaped through the way adults explain change to the young. Do not go there now. That place was once dry. There used to be houses beyond that water. The old landing was farther out. Your grandmother was born near a shore that is gone. These are the kinds of sentences by which landscapes survive after landscapes disappear. A country can endure in speech long after it has vanished physically, not because anyone has a map, but because enough people continue to speak of where things used to be. The lost Black Sea margins may have lived that way for generations after they were gone, preserved in explanation, warning, grief, and repetition. And then perhaps even that began to thin. Children born far from the drowned shore would know it only as a story. Grandchildren would know it as a strange old certainty the elders insisted on. Over longer spans, memory might condense into a tale of rising water, a warning from ancestors, an account no longer tied to exact geography. History dissolves, pattern remains. When archaeologists search for evidence of prehistoric communities beneath or around the Black Sea, they are not merely looking for impressive objects, they are trying to recover the texture of vanished life. A stone tool can be useful, but on its own it says little. A cluster of tools near a hearth says more. Pottery fragments in a pattern of repeated deposition say more still. Animal bones, seeds, sediments, altered by human fire, post holes, floor traces, refuse pits, worked wood, fibers preserved in unusual conditions. These are the things that build a settlement out of fragments. The difficulty, of course, is that underwater archaeology is hard even in the best conditions. Sites may lie deeply buried. Later sediments can protect them, distort them, or hide them almost completely. The exact place where a prehistoric shoreline settlement once stood may now be far from any obvious underwater landmark. Sea level changes, erosion, river action, and later marine processes may have scattered what remains. What looks like a promising anomaly may prove natural. What looks empty may hide a whole layer of occupation below. Still, the Black Sea is unusually tantalizing because certain deep conditions may preserve fragile materials better than many other environments would. That does not guarantee discovery. But it means the dream of finding more direct evidence is not foolish. A worked timber, a preserved structure, a cluster of habitation traces on an old drowned shoreline, a buried settlement edge, any of these could transform how we understand the human story of the basin. And yet, even without spectacular discoveries, archaeology already teaches an important lesson about prehistoric life. The absence of giant monuments does not imply the absence of meaningful communities. Most human history was lived in places that were materially modest and socially rich. If the Black Sea covered such places, then what it swallowed may have looked ordinary from close up and enormous from far away. That is why a single recovered object from the drowned margins would matter so much. Not because it would prove a legend in dramatic fashion, but because it would narrow the distance between inference and presence. It would let us say, with greater confidence, not only that land drowned here, but that people once made a life on it. It is tempting to talk about the inhabitants of the lost Black Sea shore as though they were one people, one culture, one language, one way of life. But the region was likely more varied than that. Different stretches of coast may have held different communities with different rhythms of movement, different levels of permanence, different technologies, and different relationships to neighboring groups. Some may have intermarried across distance. Some may have traded. Some may have avoided one another. Some may have been linked by kinship roots invisible to us now. This diversity is important because it makes the drowned world beneath the sea feel more real. Real human landscapes are uneven. One village can be long established, while another nearby is only seasonal. One group may adopt pottery early while another does not. One family may decide to move inland sooner than another. Environmental pressure does not fall on all people equally. So when we ask who lived on the lost land, the most honest answer is not a single label. It is a human mosaic. Fishers, gatherers, hunters, early farmers, children, elders, skilled boat users, net makers, pot users, animal keepers, people buried near the water, people born inland and married to the coast, people who thought the shore was permanent because their parents had thought the same. The terrible thing about environmental loss is that it often erases this diversity from later imagination. We collapse many lives into one image of victims. But the sea does not drown in abstraction. It drowns separate worlds at once. One household loses a landing place. Another loses fields. Another loses a burial site. Another leaves early and survives. Another waits too long. Another never appears in the record at all, except as the absence left behind. In that sense, the people behind the Black Sea theory are more moving precisely because they remain partly unknowable. We cannot turn them into tidy historical characters. We can only approach them through likelihood, analogy, archaeology, and care. That is enough to say they were real, even if their names are lost. By now, the drowned Black Sea margin has become populated in the mind. Not with fantasy, not with shining mythical cities, but with people doing what human beings have always done near water: fishing, gathering, repairing, burying, storing, moving, watching, arguing, raising children, and trusting familiar ground. That is the right scale at which to feel this story. The tragedy does not depend on grandeur. It depends on ordinary life meeting a change larger than ordinary skill could fully contain. And this is where the story grows sharper. Once we admit that the lost land beneath the Black Sea may indeed have been inhabited in many ways, the next question cannot be avoided. What traces of those people have survived? What has the seafloor actually kept? Is there evidence not only of changing shorelines and drowned valleys, but of direct human presence structures, objects, worked materials, old settlement edges, unmistakable signs that daily life once existed where only dark water now lies. That is the next movement of the mystery. The people are plausible. The landscape invites them. The wider prehistory of the region makes their presence likely. But likelihood is only the beginning. To come closer, we have to descend from the level of human imagination to the level of clue, to wood, sediment, shells, sonar lines, buried surfaces, and the fragile traces by which vanished lives sometimes speak. That is where the Black Sea becomes not only a lost world, but an underwater search. Once people begin to imagine lost shores beneath the Black Sea, the next instinct is simple. Go look, send down cameras, map the bottom. Search for walls, tools, hearths, timber, pottery, anything that can bridge the enormous distance between possibility and proof. This is the point where the mystery changes shape. Up to now, we have been moving through geography, climate, and human plausibility. Now we arrive at the harder discipline of evidence. And evidence underwater is a patient thing. The seafloor does not present itself like a museum. It does not arrange its clues in neat order. It covers, shifts, preserves, distorts, and conceals. A drowned shoreline is not a photograph frozen in time. It is a former living surface altered by sediment, current, chemical conditions, later collapses, biological activity, and all the slow pressures of being underwater for thousands of years. Even when something survives, it may survive in pieces, out of context, or so deeply buried that it remains invisible unless one looks in exactly the right place and in exactly the right way. This is why underwater archaeology is as much about reading landscapes as it is about finding artifacts. A single object can be exciting, but a landscape tells the deeper story. An old beach ridge, a submerged river channel, a shelf edge, a buried soil, a change in shell layers, a line that suggests former shoreline stability. All of these can say something about where people might once have lived. Before a settlement is found, the world around that settlement has to be understood. The ancient coast must first be rebuilt in the mind. That reconstruction is what makes the Black Sea so absorbing. The basin offers not just the hope of isolated finds, but the possibility of recovering whole environmental settings now lying underwater. One does not need a palace or a city to prove that a lived world was lost. A drowned beach, a former estuary, a preserved wetland edge, and a cluster of human traces on an ancient surface would be enough to change the emotional scale of the story. It would tell us that the drowned country beneath the sea was not a metaphor alone. It was a real zone of life. Still, the sea demands humility. A shape on sonar is not automatically a structure. A regular line in sediment is not automatically a path. A worked-looking object is not always human-made. Underwater research is full of false hopes, because human beings are good at seeing patterns even where none exist. The Black Sea offers enough mystery already. It does not need to be forced. So the task is not to dream less, but to look more carefully. The clues beneath the water are meaningful, precisely because they are difficult. They ask for restraint. They ask for a kind of listening that can tolerate silence for a long time before any clear answer emerges. If you wanted to search for a drowned prehistoric world, the first thing you would need is not a shovel. It would be a map of the old ground. Not a modern map, but a reconstruction of where ancient shorelines may have been, where rivers once cut across low terrain, where marshes may have opened, where stable settlement surfaces might have existed, and which parts of the basin floor were once usable land rather than steep or hostile terrain. This is where marine survey becomes so important. Sonar and bathymetric mapping allow researchers to see the shape of the underwater land without directly touching every part of it. That shape matters immensely. The seafloor is not uniform. Some places slope gently in ways that make former coastal use plausible. Some preserve the traces of old channels. Some look like drowned terraces or beach formations. Others are steep, unstable, or deeply buried under later deposits. A map of contours becomes a map of possibility. The ancient coast of the Black Sea would not have been one clean, elegant line. Like most coasts, it would have shifted with local topography, river mouths, and changing water levels. Some areas would have formed broad, low margins that could support camps, villages, or work areas. Other zones would have offered landing spots or marsh-edge resources. Some shelves would have disappeared under later waters more rapidly than others, depending on gradient and local conditions. All of this matters because human beings do not settle abstractly. They settle where the land makes sense. When researchers trace submerged channels or identify what may be former shore features, they are doing more than making technical observations. They are rebuilding the stage on which life may have unfolded. A drowned river valley, for example, is not only a geological feature. It hints at fresh water, movement, animals, vegetation, and the kind of ecological richness that tends to attract human use. A former shoreline ridge suggests a place where water once paused long enough for stability. Stability matters because repeated human occupation tends to gather where the environment is predictable enough to trust. This is also where the Black Sea begins to feel less like a blank underwater basin and more like a layered terrain. One can picture slopes that were once walked, flats that may have supported reeds and birds, channels that may have been followed inland, and edges where boats could once be drawn up. Under modern water, these shapes look mute, but in their own time, they would have been as legible to local people as roads and harbors are to us. And once you begin to reconstruct that earlier legibility, the seafloor becomes difficult to see as empty. Even before any clear settlement is found, the ground itself begins to suggest patterns of use. It says that there were places where life would have made sense. Archaeology often begins there, not with dramatic proof, but with the quiet recognition that the land once invited people in. To most of us, sediment is just mud, silt, or sand. Under the eye of science, it becomes memory. Layer by layer, seabed deposits preserve changes in environment, salinity, biological life, erosion, flood input, and water conditions over long spans of time. They do not preserve history in words, but they preserve sequence. Something happened before something else. One kind of shell appears, then another. One depositional environment gives way to the next. A former land surface is buried. An old channel is filled. A wetland becomes marine. This matters because when direct human evidence is thin, sediment can still confirm that a world changed in ways humans would have felt. A buried soil horizon may indicate former dry land. A transition in shell species may signal changing salinity or water connection. Riverborne layers may hint at old drainage patterns later overtaken by the sea. These are not substitutes for archaeology, but they make archaeology more intelligible. They tell us what kind of world we are searching within. There is something strangely beautiful about this. The drowned landscape beneath the Black Sea may not preserve many voices, but it preserves sequences of transformation. It remembers in physical form the difference between land and water, between fresher conditions and saltier ones, between one ecological order and another. It remembers thresholds, even when it does not explain them. For the people who may have lived there, those thresholds would not have felt like layers in a core sample. They would have felt like instability. Yet from our distant perspective, those layered sediments are one of the few ways to follow the change back toward them. We learn that a former coast existed because sediment says so. We learn that an environment shifted because micro-remains and shells suggest so. We begin to narrow the possible windows during which human communities could have occupied certain margins. There is also a kind of discipline in this work that suits the Black Sea story especially well. It refuses melodrama. A core sample does not care what theory is fashionable. It yields data slowly. It has to be dated, compared, interpreted, doubted, tested again. That patience is necessary because the Black Sea has invited large claims for many years. Sediment is one of the tools that keeps those claims grounded. And yet, despite its restraint, sediment can be quietly haunting. A line in a core can mean that a former surface was suddenly or gradually buried by advancing water. A change in deposited material can mean that a once dry edge of life ceased to be dry. A dark band below later marine deposits can mean that under the sea lies a horizon that once knew air. In that sense, mud is not mundane at all. It is the sea's way of writing over an older text without fully destroying it. Among the most modest but powerful clues in the Black Sea are shells. Small, fragile, often easy to overlook, they are part of the basin's long conversation about what kind of water existed at what time. Different species thrive under different salinity conditions. Some indicate fresher or brackish settings, others more marine ones. When shells appear in sequence within dated sediments, they can help researchers reconstruct changes in water, character, and connection. This may sound like a narrow technical concern, but it reaches straight into the heart of the story. If the basin's waters changed significantly as outside marine influence increased, then the ecology of the shore changed too. Fish communities, wetland dynamics, and the entire practical knowledge of human groups around the lower margins may have been affected. A shell sequence is therefore not merely a biological record. It is a trace of the world people used. What makes shells especially useful is that they belong to ordinary environmental life. They are not rare ceremonial objects or exceptional finds. They are part of the background fabric of the shore. Because of that, they can tell us about long-term conditions rather than singular events. A shell does not prove a catastrophic flood by itself, nor does it rule one out, but it helps identify the kind of basin in which any flood, reconnection, or gradual rise took place. The difficulty, as always, is interpretation. Shell assemblages can be moved, mixed, or affected by local conditions. Dating can be difficult. One site does not automatically represent the whole basin. Regional variation matters. This is why the Black Sea debate remains alive. The basin is large, and evidence from one area cannot always be stretched confidently over every drowned margin. Still, shell evidence contributes something emotionally important to the story. It reminds us that environmental transformation is rarely abstract. When water changes character, daily life follows. The people on the ancient shore may not have understood salinity as chemistry, but they would have understood that certain fish no longer gathered in the same way, that certain zones behaved differently, that the water did not feel as it once had. Human adaptation often begins with sensory noticing long before explanation arrives. There is also a deeper humility in this kind of clue. The Black Sea does not surrender its mysteries through grand declarations. Sometimes it does so through the quiet presence of tiny lives that once inhabited its margins. Shells, like seeds and pollen, belong to the smallest witnesses. They are minor things that survive where names do not. Through them, the basin tells us that transformation happened not only at the scale of continents and straits, but at the scale of the shoreline itself. All of this landscape work leads toward the same desire. At some point, one wants a sign no one can dismiss, a post hole, a worked timber, a hearth, a cluster of pottery, a floor surface. A clear pattern of repeated human activity on what can be shown to have once been dry land, something unmistakably human, not merely probable. This desire is understandable. Landscapes suggest. Human traces confirm. The difference between the two is enormous. Once there is direct evidence of habitation beneath the Black Sea in the right context, the whole emotional balance of the story changes. We are no longer speaking only of where people might logically have lived. We are speaking of a specific lost place where they did. But the sea is selective in what it allows. Most prehistoric habitation traces are delicate. They survive poorly on open ground even without later inundation. Add erosion, burial, underwater chemistry, and thousands of years of change, and the odds narrow sharply. One should not expect the drowned Black Sea margins to yield neat villages outlined as if abandoned yesterday. If evidence survives, it may come in fragments. A worked edge of wood, ceramic shards buried in a stable layer, concentrations of stone tools, burned surfaces, unusual alignments of timbers. Even then, context will matter more than drama. This is why underwater discovery often moves in stages. First, a landscape feature is identified. Then, a promising zone is surveyed. Then, anomalies are documented. Then, selective investigation tests whether those anomalies are natural or cultural. Then, interpretation begins, often cautiously, sometimes painfully slowly. Public imagination prefers the final moment of revelation, but real research spends much of its life in the long corridor before revelation, where doubt is necessary and excitement must be kept under control. The Black Sea is especially prone to this tension because the stakes are so tempting. The idea of a drowned, inhabited world is powerful enough that every suggestive clue attracts attention. Yet honest archaeology has to resist the pressure to make the evidence bigger than it is. A promising object is not yet a settlement. A possible structure is not automatically a village. A deep water find may show remarkable preservation without proving the whole imagined lost country. And yet, even with all these cautions, the desire for the unmistakably human remains valid. It is not greed. It is a form of respect. We want to know whether people really were there, because if they were, then the sea floor beneath the Black Sea is not just a witness to water change. It is a witness to interrupted lives. Among all the possible materials that might survive beneath the Black Sea, wood has a special power over the imagination. Stone tools are important. Pottery is informative. Bones can be intimate, but worked wood feels closer to the hand. A shaped timber, a carved surface, a post, a plank, part of a structure, or boat. These are things that seem to hold labor in a direct way. One can almost feel the cut, the pressure, the intention. In many underwater settings, wood decays badly. In certain deep Black Sea conditions, however, preservation can be unusually good because oxygen is limited. This does not mean every ancient wooden thing survives. Far from it. But it means the possibility cannot be dismissed. And when wood does survive underwater, it can be astonishingly evocative. It preserves not only form but often craftsmanship. It carries the difference between branch and beam, between natural drift and human shaping. That possibility is one reason the Black Sea has fascinated underwater researchers for so long. A drowned prehistoric shoreline where organic materials survived even partly would be extraordinarily valuable. Most prehistoric sites on land have already lost much of their organic texture. Fibers, wood, woven materials, and other fragile elements vanish first. Under the right underwater conditions, some of that lost texture can endure. If found in clear context, such material could narrow the gap between us and daily life in a way stone alone cannot. There is something almost unfairly moving about the idea of a wooden structure under the Black Sea. Wood belongs to shelter, repair, boats, doorways, fish traps, floors, poles, ladders, and all the practical things by which ordinary people shaped their world. If such things remain in darkness beneath the basin, then the drowned landscape is not only geologically real, it is domestically real. It once held thresholds, supports, work surfaces, and living spaces. But once again, caution matters. Wood can drift. It can be redeposited. A preserved timber does not automatically prove a settlement on the exact spot where it lies. Context is everything. Was it found in relation to an ancient surface? Was it worked? Was it associated with other traces? Does dating place it in the relevant window? Archaeology is often the art of preventing beautiful finds from being asked to say more than they can. Still, one understands why wood stirs such hope. It carries the warmth of human intention into cold water. It suggests that the old shore was not only walked upon, but built upon. That someone, long ago, made something there that was meant to hold. At this stage in the story, it becomes clear why the Black Sea can never be resolved with one discovery alone. Even if a spectacular submerged site were found tomorrow, the basin is so large and its history so layered that no single site could answer every question. Was flooding sudden everywhere? How dense were the populations? How many communities lived along the lost margins? How many people escaped? How many drowned? Proof in one area would still leave uncertainty elsewhere. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is simply the nature of the problem. Human settlement along ancient coasts tends to be patchy. Preservation is selective. Dating windows overlap imperfectly. Local geography matters. A dramatic structure in one drowned bay might confirm habitation there, without telling us how another part of the basin changed. A preserved work area might reveal one community's life while leaving nearby seasonal groups invisible. That means the Black Sea should not be imagined as waiting for a single silver bullet of evidence. Instead, knowledge will probably come as accumulation. More mapped paleo shorelines, better dating, better environmental reconstruction, more targeted underwater surveys, a handful of convincing human traces in strong context, perhaps eventually a site or cluster of sites that anchors the wider picture more firmly. There is something fitting about that. A lost country of ordinary life would not necessarily reappear through one spectacular revelation. It would return piece by piece, the way ordinary life always exists in the first place. Not as one grand statement, but as many repeated acts. A hearth here, a landing place there, a worked timber, a seed, a potsherd, a buried floor. Civilization on the scale of daily life is assembled from small things. Its recovery may have to be as well. This gradualness can be frustrating to anyone who wants clean conclusions, but it also protects the story from distortion. The Black Sea has already inspired enough oversized claims. Slow accumulation is healthier. It lets each clue retain its proper weight. It allows the drowned landscape to emerge honestly rather than theatrically. And perhaps there is an ethical side to this too. The people who may have lost their shores deserve not to be turned into props for a dramatic theory. Their world, if it can be partly recovered, should be recovered carefully. Proof should serve understanding, not spectacle. The Black Sea is unusual because it can preserve and erase at the same time. This is true of all seas to some degree, but the Black Sea heightens the contrast. In certain deep, low-oxygen conditions, fragile materials may survive better than expected, yet access to them is difficult. Context can be buried. Shallow zones can be heavily altered. Shore processes before inundation may already have destroyed much. Later, marine deposition can protect and conceal in the same motion. This double character makes every potential discovery feel almost philosophical. The sea is not just hiding the past, it is remaking the conditions under which the past can be known. A drowned shoreline may be better preserved than an equivalent land site in one respect, and far harder to locate or interpret in another. The sea keeps, but it keeps on its own terms. For the imagined communities of the lost Black Sea margin, this is a strange afterlife. The places where they lived may have been spared some kinds of decay only by becoming inaccessible to generations of the living. Their floors, timbers, or work areas, if preserved, survived because the world that used them ended. Preservation is not mercy, it is consequence. This also explains why the Black Sea has such emotional pull beyond ordinary archaeology. It is one of the few places where the idea of a drowned prehistoric world is not merely poetic. There are real conditions here that make preservation plausible enough to sustain hope. Not certainty, but hope. Enough to keep expeditions returning. Enough to keep maps being redrawn. Enough to make each anomaly on the sea floor feel like a possible window. And yet the sea still refuses to become transparent. It takes away scale. It takes away easy visibility. It takes away the ordinary intimacy of excavation. Underwater research is mediated by instruments, vehicles, cameras, sampling devices, and difficult logistics. One cannot simply kneel beside a trench and brush away soil. The distance between researcher and site is literal as well as historical. That distance matters because it shapes the emotional tone of the evidence. Finds from the Black Sea often arrive to us already filtered through technology, dark water, remote images, and cautious interpretation. The lost country remains lost even when a clue appears. We are allowed glimpses, not return. Perhaps the most important sentence in this whole part is the simplest one. A clue is not a conclusion. The Black Sea demands that sentence over and over again. A submerged shoreline feature suggests former land, but not necessarily habitation. A worked object suggests human presence, but not necessarily a permanent settlement. A preserved structure suggests occupation, but not automatically the scale of a drowned country. A deep-sea discovery can be extraordinary without proving every larger claim attached to it. This may seem cautious to the point of dullness, but in fact, it protects the true wonder of the story. If every clue is forced into an oversized conclusion, the mystery becomes flimsy. If each clue is allowed to stand honestly, the mystery becomes stronger because it is real. The difference between dramatic storytelling and careful narration is not that one feels and the other does not. It is that careful narration earns its feeling. The Black Sea has already earned enough. We know lower landscapes existed. We know the basin changed profoundly. We know human communities plausibly lived on vulnerable margins. We know underwater conditions in some parts of the sea can preserve remarkable materials. We know researchers have good reason to search for submerged prehistoric evidence. That is already a powerful foundation. It does not need embellishment. In a way, restraint makes the story sadder. The honest version leaves room for lost lives without pretending they can be neatly recovered. It allows for drowned settlements without claiming every anomaly is one. It accepts that the unknown number in the title may remain unknown not because the event was imaginary, but because the world that could have counted itself disappeared before counting became history. So the clues beneath the water do something unusual. They do not close the story. They deepen it. Each mapped channel, each buried surface, each preserved object or environmental trace adds weight to the possibility that what lies beneath the Black Sea is not empty geology, but interrupted human geography. Yet each clue also reminds us that interruption is not the same as restoration. We may learn more and more without ever fully getting the lost world back. By now, the Black Sea floor has become more than a setting. It has become an archive of thresholds: land to water, fresh to saltier, inhabited margin to submerged silence, ordinary life to absence. The clues beneath it are enough to make the lost world feel tangible, but not enough to fully restore its people. That tension matters because it leads directly to the hardest question in the story. Not whether land drowned. It did. Not whether people may have lived there. They almost certainly did in some form. But what happened to them when the land was taken? This is where archaeology reaches a limit. It can show former surfaces, it can recover objects, it can identify environmental change. It may even find unmistakable traces of human habitation beneath later waters. But the sea is much less generous when asked for body counts, fear, hesitation, migration choices, or the exact human rhythm of disaster. It does not easily distinguish between those who left in time and those who did not. It does not tabulate children carried inland, elders who refused to move, fishers caught in sudden change, or families that watched the old shore disappear over several generations. And so the search beneath the water leads not only toward evidence, but toward uncertainty of a more painful kind. The more clearly we see that a real inhabited world may lie under the Black Sea, the more sharply the next question presses in. If this drowned landscape was full of camps, villages, routes, and lives, then how many people were lost when the basin changed? How many escaped? How many vanished without record? How many were taken by sudden water? And how many by the slower cruelty of displacement? That is the point where the sea stops being only a mystery of place and becomes a mystery of human cost. There are some losses that history records in painfully neat forms. A battle ends, and someone counts the dead, even badly. A city burns, and later officials try to measure what was destroyed. A plague passes, and tax records, burials, and legal documents preserve part of the damage. The numbers may be wrong, incomplete, or politically shaped, but at least they exist. They enter the written world. They become something later generations can argue over. The possible human loss beneath the Black Sea belongs to a far more difficult category. It may have been immense in emotional terms, widespread in geographical terms, and deeply important in human memory. Yet it happened before the communities most affected could preserve a written accounting of what was taken. That is why the title's central line has such unusual force. Nobody knows how many people drowned, not because the question has never been asked, but because the type of event we may be dealing with lies in one of the darkest gaps between lived catastrophe and historical record. It is important to slow down here and resist two opposite temptations. The first is exaggeration. One can imagine dramatic scenes of entire populations swallowed in a single overwhelming flood, and there is a part of the mind that prefers such clarity because it gives the unknown a shape. The second temptation is flattening. Because we cannot count the dead, it becomes easy to speak as though perhaps there were very few of them, or as though uncertainty somehow softens the loss. Neither temptation is honest. The truth is more difficult. We do not know the number, but not knowing the number is not the same as saying there was no disaster. A drowned prehistoric landscape creates a special kind of historical silence. The land that held homes, paths, work areas, and perhaps graves disappears beneath later waters. The people who might have counted their own losses leave no official text. Those who survive move elsewhere, and what they carry with them is likely memory rather than enumeration. By the time much later cultures begin writing flood stories, origin stories, or regional histories, the exact arithmetic of any earlier drowning would already be gone. And yet the question remains because human beings naturally ask it. How many? We ask it to make loss real. We ask it because a number, even an imperfect one, gives shape to grief. Without a number, the mind drifts between extremes. One drowned family or 10,000, one village or an entire inhabited coastline. The Black Sea denies us that certainty. It offers instead a more haunting proposition. The number may have mattered greatly to the people who lived through the event, but the number itself did not survive the event. To understand why no reliable count can be made, it helps to list the missing pieces, not coldly, but clearly. We do not know exactly how many people lived on the vulnerable low margins of the ancient Black Sea at the key phases of rising water. We do not know whether settlement was dense or sparse in every region. We do not know whether some stretches were heavily used only seasonally. We do not know whether the most dangerous changes came in one concentrated phase or in repeated episodes across long spans of time. We do not know how many communities left early. We do not know how many stayed. We do not know how many died directly by drowning, how many by displacement and its aftereffects, and how many escaped altogether. Each one of those unknowns matters. Remove enough of them, and the whole numerical question becomes unstable. Even if one tried to estimate the population of the lost margins in the broadest sense, the answer would rest on assumptions about settlement density, resource productivity, mobility, social organization, and environmental timing. Those assumptions might be reasonable, but they would still be assumptions. Any final number would look more precise than the underlying evidence deserves. This is one reason serious historical reconstruction is sometimes less satisfying than dramatic storytelling. Dramatic storytelling is happy with an image of whole villages overtaken overnight. Historical reconstruction asks harder questions. How many villages? How large were they? Were they permanent? How fast did the water rise at that exact location? Did the people have boats? Was the lowland already being abandoned? Were there warning signs for years? Did some groups shift inland with little direct loss of life? Did others remain in hazardous zones longer than they should have? The more one asks, the more the number begins to dissolve. There is also the problem of preservation. A later archaeological survey may identify a drowned shoreline or possible habitation traces, but it is much harder to identify the full social size of the community that once used that place. A site may have been occupied by a few families at one time, many more during a seasonal event, or different groups across generations. What counts as population in such a setting? The number of permanent residents, the broader kin network that returned there, the people moving along coastal circuits who relied on the site occasionally. Ancient life rarely fits the stable categories that later states produce. The sea, of course, worsens every difficulty. It covers the land, alters the surface, hides the most perishable traces, and separates later investigators from the human scale of the original world. The drowned landscape beneath the Black Sea can still be studied, but it cannot easily be counted. The old lines that would matter for counting households, burial groups, repeated structures, storage zones, fields, pathways, are exactly the kinds of things most easily fragmented by time, inundation, and later marine processes. So the unknown number is not the result of laziness or lack of curiosity. It is the result of a world vanishing in the wrong way for later arithmetic. When people hear the phrase, "how many drowned?" the mind immediately pictures bodies taken by water. That may indeed have happened, perhaps in some places more than others, perhaps in ways we can barely reconstruct. But it is worth pausing over another truth. In prehistoric environmental disasters, death by drowning may be only one part of the human cost. A coastline can kill directly. It can also kill by dislocation. Suppose the water rose rapidly enough in some locations to overtake homes, camps, or work areas. In those cases, there may have been immediate panic, flight, and loss of life. Boats might not have been sufficient. Night, weather, children, elders, or simple confusion could turn a dangerous inundation into mass death, even in communities familiar with water. Yet even if people escaped the first movement of the sea, they were not instantly safe. They still had to resettle, feed themselves, protect the vulnerable, preserve social ties, and adapt knowledge suited to one landscape to another landscape that might already be occupied or less productive. That is where the number grows even more elusive. How many died in the water itself? How many died because food systems collapsed during forced movement? How many were lost in later conflict with neighboring groups over land and resources? How many infants, elders, or injured people failed to survive relocation? How many communities fragmented so badly that direct lines of memory were broken? The human cost of environmental upheaval is rarely contained within the moment of physical inundation. This matters because the Black Sea story is sometimes imagined too narrowly. A wall of water, a dramatic drowning, then silence. Real life is more extended and, in some ways, more cruel. A lower shore, abandoned under pressure, leaves behind not just the dead, but also the living, and the living carry the burden of incomplete escape. They have to become people from a place that no longer exists. They have to build continuity out of interruption. In that sense, the title's question may even be too small if taken literally. Nobody knows how many people drowned, yes. But nobody knows the full number of people whose lives were broken by the drowning of the land. Some would have survived bodily and still lost almost everything that gave daily life its pattern. The right fishing places, the old paths, the graves of kin, the confidence that next season could be prepared for in familiar ways. A disaster without account is not only a problem of arithmetic, it is a problem of categories. What exactly are we counting? Bodies in water, households erased, communities scattered, knowledge made useless, children uprooted, memory severed from place. The Black Sea holds all of these possibilities in darkness at once. Because the human toll depends so much on pace, it is worth imagining the first possibility with care. What if, in some regions or phases, the flooding was fast enough to be experienced as a direct catastrophe? Not a gradual inconvenience, not a shoreline slowly shifting over generations, but a frightening advance that outran ordinary adjustment. In that case, the danger would not come only from the final moment. It would build through uncertainty, water behaving wrongly, the old boundaries failing, ground once trusted becoming unstable, marsh and shore merging into something wider and deeper than before. A stream or inlet widening faster than memory could normalize it. People might argue over whether the change was temporary or permanent. Some would act early, others would hesitate. Ancient communities were not less intelligent than we are, but they were human in the same way we are, attached to familiar places, reluctant to abandon labor already invested, unsure whether the worst reading of events is really the true one. Once water moves beyond hesitation, disaster becomes social as much as physical. A community rarely leaves all at once in perfect order. Someone is always slower, someone refuses. Someone returns for stored goods, someone stays with an elder who cannot move quickly, someone goes back for tools, animals, or children, someone believes the water will stop where it always stopped before. If the Black Sea margins experienced even a few episodes of sharp inundation, then death by drowning could have occurred not as a single mythic moment, but as many local tragedies multiplied across vulnerable shores. The most painful thing about such a scenario is how ordinary the people involved would have been. No one on those low coasts would have believed they were standing inside a theory that later generations would debate. They would simply have been people trying to decide whether to stay or leave. They would have used the knowledge available to them: old markers, remembered storms, animal behavior, the judgment of elders, the behavior of boats, the feel of the ground underfoot. If those tools failed, they failed not because the people were foolish, but because the scale of change had outrun the local past. And if the flooding was truly sudden in some localities, then the number of drowned could have risen beyond what later imagination can comfortably hold. Not necessarily into legendary millions, as careless retellings sometimes imply, but enough to leave a wound that no survivor could count fully. A cluster of settlements along a vulnerable low edge. A river-mouth community overtaken. Families trapped between advancing water and uncertain escape routes. Boats insufficient for the whole group. Bad weather at the wrong time. Darkness. Panic. Children, the uncounted, are built from such ordinary vulnerabilities. This is one possible Black Sea. It is not proven everywhere. It may never be provable everywhere. But if it happened at all, even in pieces, then some of the drowned beneath that sea are not just symbolic. They are literal dead. And yet the slower version must be taken just as seriously. There is a tendency to assume that gradual environmental change is somehow less terrible because it allows time. Time certainly helps in some ways. It permits observation, relocation, adaptation, and planning. But slowness can also deepen sorrow, because it forces people to live inside the loss while it is happening. Imagine a shoreline that retreats inland, not in one terrifying burst, but over years and generations. The old landing place becomes unreliable. A flat, once used in dry months, remains wet. Reed beds shift. Some fishing grounds improve, while others worsen. One family moves uphill a short distance. Another holds on. A burial ground near the edge becomes vulnerable, then unreachable. A child grows up hearing that the water used to be farther out. An elder remembers walking to a place that now requires a boat. The coast is still there, but not the same coast. In such a world, fewer people may die immediately by drowning, but the old human landscape still dies, and it may do so in a way that is even harder to record. There is no single day of destruction. There are only accumulating departures, storage pits abandoned, camps not reused, huts rebuilt elsewhere, fields or gardens shifted, paths forgotten. A place that used to hold ordinary life becomes an intermittent memory, then a warning, then a story, then nothing visible at all. How many people are lost in this version? That depends on what one means by lost. The number of sudden drowning victims may be smaller than in the catastrophic model. The number of people whose lives are reshaped by forced retreat may be larger. Whole communities may survive, but become other communities elsewhere. Family lines continue, but their country does not. The old shore is not annihilated in one blow. It is surrendered piece by piece until surrender itself becomes normal. There is something almost unbearable about that. Catastrophe gives no time to say goodbye. Slow drowning gives too much. People continue to live beside the evidence that the world they inherited is failing. They probably argue about when to leave. They carry goods inland. They return to check what remains. They speak of the old shore in the present tense for longer than accuracy allows, because the habits of belonging lag behind reality. At some point, a generation is born that never knew the earlier coast, and then the disaster changes kind. It becomes memory instead of experience. This version of the Black Sea could still produce drownings, storms, local collapses, dangerous crossings, or misjudged encroachments would still kill. But the full human toll would emerge through migration, hunger, stress, exposure, and the weakening of social stability. Nobody could count it then, and nobody can count it now. The number dissolves not because the suffering was small, but because it was stretched across time. So whether the Black Sea changed quickly or slowly, the arithmetic remains beyond us. One version loses the number in panic. The other loses the number in duration. Another difficulty lies in the question of how many people could have been there in the first place. Without some sense of population, even broad human loss estimates drift. But prehistoric population is one of the hardest things to reconstruct well. There was no census, no tax roll, no list of villages, no archive of households. What historians and archaeologists have instead are models based on settlement remains, environmental productivity, mobility patterns, ethnographic analogy, and the broader archaeological picture of the region. Such models can tell us that a favorable coast could support meaningful human presence. They can suggest whether a region likely hosted scattered camps, repeated seasonal use, clusters of villages, or somewhat denser pockets of settlement at certain times. They can remind us that a broad lowland by a productive shore need not have been empty, but they rarely give anything like a confident headcount. A single apparent settlement might represent a few households or a much wider network that gathered seasonally. A region with modest permanent population might still have seen many more people pass through over time. This becomes especially important if the ancient Black Sea margins were inhabited by a mix of fishers, foragers, semi-sedentary groups, and early farming communities. Different lifeways produce different patterns of density and visibility. A village with storage pits and repeated building episodes may appear more legible archaeologically than a seasonal return site equally important to a mobile group, yet both matter for human cost. If water overtook both, who counts as population? Only those present at a given moment, or everyone whose annual cycle depended on the place. A modern mind wants a map with dots labeled village and a population estimate attached to each dot. Ancient coastlines refuse that neatness. Human presence may have been clustered, mobile, layered through time, and unevenly distributed. Some stretches of lost shore may have supported substantial repeated use. Others may have been lightly occupied. Some may have been abandoned before the worst water arrived. Others may have remained attractive until too late. This is why any confident number offered for Black Sea drownings should be met with caution. The ground truth needed to sustain such precision has not survived. The right thing to say is both less dramatic and more honest. We cannot know the number, but we have reason to believe that the lost margins were not empty, and that real human communities may have been overtaken, displaced, or erased as the basin changed. That kind of honesty can feel emotionally unsatisfying. But in another way, it is more respectful. It does not steal certainty from the dead. It leaves room for the real scale of the unknown. One reason the drowned do not form a clear count is that some of the threatened did not drown. They moved, and in moving, they vanished into other histories. This is easy to overlook because survival can make a group disappear from the very story that endangered it. Once a community leaves a drowned shore and settles elsewhere, later generations may know them only in their new location. The old coast survives only in memory, if at all. This matters because the Black Sea's human cost may be partly hidden inside migration. Families or kin groups pushed inland or along new coastal margins may have joined existing communities, merged with neighbors, competed for ground, or passed their traditions into entirely new settings. If later archaeologists find settlement growth somewhere inland, it may be difficult to know whether that growth reflects local development, incoming displaced groups, or both. Prehistory is full of movement that leaves subtle signatures rather than neat labels. In such a world, the drowned and the displaced are inseparable. A migration stream may contain the children of drowned settlements, widows of those taken by water, survivors carrying tools from abandoned homes, elders trying to remember the old shore, and newcomers forced into negotiation with strangers over access to land and resources. None of that produces a number carved into the historical record. It produces blending, friction, adaptation, and eventual forgetting. There is also the possibility that memories of the drowned country, if they survived at all, survived through such migrants. A people who leave because their low world is being taken by water do not necessarily preserve precise dates or statistics. What they preserve are patterns of warning. The water came too far. The old shore was lost. There were homes where the sea is now. We came from a place that is gone. These are the kinds of truths migration carries. This is one reason the Black Sea has been linked, cautiously, to later flood traditions. Not because one can prove a simple one-to-one line from a geological event to a specific ancient text, but because migration is one of the great carriers of environmental memory. The displaced take stories with them. Over generations, story outlives geography. The emotional core remains even as details shift. So when we ask how many drowned, we must also hold another question in the background. How many survived only by becoming unrecognizable to later history? How many people from the lost margins live on invisibly inside other archaeological cultures, other settlement patterns, other communities that never again named the drowned shore directly? The Black Sea may have buried one country and scattered its human inheritance widely enough that later generations no longer saw the pieces as belonging together. There is a difference between an unknown dead person and an unknowable dead person. The unknown dead are individuals whose names are lost, but whose death is still visible in some form. A grave, a skeleton, a burial field, a disaster layer. The unknowable dead are harder. They are those whose existence as individuals cannot be recovered directly, whose death is inferred only because the conditions of loss make it almost certain that some must have perished, even though no separate trace of them can be confidently found. The Black Sea may contain both kinds, though the second kind almost certainly dominates. If future archaeology were to uncover submerged burials or bodies in clear context, that would change the texture of the discussion. But even then, such finds would be fragments. Most of the human loss, if loss there was on a considerable scale, would remain diffuse. Bodies taken by water, sediments, currents, time, scavenging, burial under later deposits, or destruction of context would become part of the basin without remaining countable in any ordinary way. This is a profoundly unsettling thought. We tend to believe that death becomes historically real when it leaves a trace. But many prehistoric deaths did not. They remained true without becoming visible. The Black Sea asks us to sit with that difficulty. If people died as the lost margins were overtaken, Many of them may never be distinguished individually from the larger environmental silence that followed. And yet silence is not emptiness. The absence of visible dead does not mean the absence of death. It means only that the sea was more efficient than memory at removing particulars. This is one reason the number remains so haunting. It hovers between the definite and the unreachable, more than zero, perhaps far more than zero. But without the structures of record, burial visibility, and later documentation that let other historical disasters enter countable history, there is a strange kind of mercy in admitting this plainly. It frees us from the false drama of invented totals. It also frees us from the equally false comfort of assuming that uncertainty lowers the stakes. The dead beneath the Black Sea, if they are there in the numbers one suspects, belong to a category of human loss that history rarely handles well, large enough to matter, ancient enough to resist measurement, and ordinary enough in its victims that no empire later bothered to remember them. That ordinariness is exactly why they deserve to be imagined with care. So, what is the honest answer to the question, nobody knows how many people drowned? It sounds less clean than many would like. It sounds like this. If lower inhabited margins of the Black Sea were flooded, then some people almost certainly died directly, some likely escaped, and many more may have suffered the slower injuries of displacement, broken subsistence systems, and forced movement. The total number cannot be calculated with confidence because the key variables remain uncertain: the pace of flooding, the density and type of settlement, the distribution of communities, the degree of warning available, and the archaeological invisibility of many vulnerable groups. The true human cost was probably larger than any direct body count and smaller than the most sensational claims. Beyond that, humility is necessary. That may feel incomplete, but incompleteness is part of the truth. A prehistoric disaster does not owe later curiosity a neat figure. It gives us what survives: drowned landforms, environmental transitions, possible habitation traces, migration possibilities, and an expanding sense that a real human world once existed where the sea now lies. From these, one can say something meaningful without pretending to know more than the evidence permits. One can say that an inhabited landscape may have been taken. One can say that some of its people likely died in water, or because of what water forced upon them. One can say that their losses were never written down. One can say that the sea floor beneath the Black Sea may hold the remains of their country, but not the arithmetic of their grief. There is a certain dignity in that kind of answer. It refuses spectacle. It also refuses indifference. It says the dead matter, even when the number is lost. It says, the absence of exactness is not the absence of tragedy. It says, history sometimes has to stop at the edge of what can be counted and speak instead in terms of broken worlds. The Black Sea is one of those edges. At the beginning of this part, the missing number stood in the center like a hole. By now, it has changed shape. It is still empty in one sense. We still do not know how many people drowned. But the emptiness is no longer blank. It is surrounded by realities that give it weight: lower drowned landscapes, plausible settlement zones, mixed lifeways, uncertain flood pace, migration, direct death, indirect death, and the vast difficulty of reconstructing prehistoric human loss after the land itself has vanished beneath a sea. That means the number matters, but not in the usual way. It matters not because we can solve it, but because it points to the scale of what was removed from history. A written civilization loses its dead and later counts them imperfectly. A prehistoric coast loses its dead and often loses the possibility of counting with them. The Black Sea, if it truly buried an inhabited human world along its margins, did more than drown people. it drowned the record of their disappearance. And that, perhaps, is what makes the story linger so powerfully in the mind. It is not only a mystery of land and water, it is a reminder that whole human worlds can vanish with almost no official trace. Their houses fall into silt, their routes become submerged contours, their fear becomes unprovable, their dead lose their number, their children become migrants, and then ancestors elsewhere. Their country survives only as a buried possibility and perhaps as a faint pressure in stories told long afterward about water crossing where it should not have crossed. Yet there is one more thing the Black Sea asks us to consider. Even if the number can never be recovered, the memory of such a drowned world may not have vanished completely. It may have changed form. It may have passed from direct experience to story, from story to inherited warning, from warning to myth, from myth to the strange enduring sense that the sea covers not just land, but an older human horizon. That is where the final movement of this history begins, not with account but with memory. When a coastline disappears, the loss does not end when the water settles. That is only the moment when geography changes its surface. The deeper change begins afterward, in the long period when people try to go on living without the ground that once organized their lives. A drowned world leaves behind more than absence. It leaves disorientation, altered routes, broken habits, interrupted memory, and a difficult question that each generation answers differently. What do we call the place that shaped us once it no longer exists? That is where the Black Sea story becomes larger than geology and more intimate than archaeology. Beneath the modern water may lie the surfaces of an old inhabited margin, but above the water lies another kind of evidence, the way human beings remember vanished places, not always accurately, not always in a way later historians can verify. But with emotional persistence, a coast can disappear physically and continue to live inside speech. A drowned country can survive as a warning, a story, a half-believed certainty, a family memory, a pattern of fear, a ritual, an insistence that the sea was once farther out than people now think. This is one reason the Black Sea remains so difficult to leave behind even after all the caution has been stated. The careful version of the story is still powerful. A lower landscape existed, water rose over it. People may have lived there in meaningful numbers. Some were likely displaced. Some may have drowned. The number is lost. The evidence is incomplete. And yet none of that weakens the central emotional fact. A human horizon may lie beneath the sea. A place once lived in, argued over, worked upon, and trusted may now survive only as submerged terrain and uncertain memory. The final task, then, is not to force the story into perfect resolution. It is to ask what kind of memory such an event might leave behind, and what it means that the Black Sea preserves both too much and too little. Too much, because the ground itself may still exist below, with shorelines and traces waiting in darkness. Too little, because the ordinary lives attached to that ground were never written down in the way later history prefers. Between those two conditions, preserved place and vanished voice, the mystery continues. And perhaps that is why the Black Sea feels older than many other archaeological questions. It sits at the point where landscape outlasts testimony. The water remains. The people do not speak directly. What we have instead is the long echo of a place that may have become memory almost as soon as it became sea. A map preserves boundaries in space. Memory preserves significance in time. The two are not the same, and in prehistoric worlds memory mattered far more. No one along the lost margins of the ancient Black Sea had a modern coastline chart or a survey line showing precisely where their country ended. What they had instead was practical memory, where the boats used to land, where reeds were cut, where fish gathered, which ground stayed firm in wet months, which route was safe in darkness, where the graves were, where the shore used to be. This sort of knowledge is often more durable than outsiders realize. It is repeated not because it is ceremonial, but because it is useful. Children learn it while moving through the world. Adults repeat it because survival depends on repetition. Elders become important because they remember older patterns and can compare present conditions to past ones. In stable landscapes, this kind of memory feels almost invisible. It is simply life. But in changing landscapes, it becomes precious. It becomes the record of what is being lost. Imagine what that would mean during the drowning of a low Black Sea coast. Every year, perhaps every season, people compare what they see to what used to be true. This path was drier. That inlet was narrower. The old landing place was farther out. The reeds once grew there. The fish do not move the same way. Your grandfather's shelter stood beyond this line of water. Your mother says there used to be ground where now there is none. These are not literary flourishes. They are how environmental change enters the human mind. The remarkable thing is that memory can keep working even after geography becomes inaccessible. Once the old shore is gone, speech carries it. The drowned coast becomes a place described rather than visited. A vanished landing place remains real because someone still speaks of it as though it matters. A burial ground becomes unreachable, but not forgotten. A lost village continues to exist in relation to the living because people define themselves in part through what they have left behind. This is where the idea of a drowned country becomes most human. A country is not merely soil, it is recognition shared among people. It is the set of places whose names, stories, uses, and emotions are widely understood within a community. If the Black Sea swallowed such a world, then memory would be the first and most important thing not to drown completely. The land would go under, but the pattern of belonging would survive for a time in speech. How long such memory could last is another question. A generation. Several. Longer in some groups than others. Migrants may preserve it intensely for a while, and then less so as children adapt to new lands. Stories may harden into warning or loosen into myth. Details may fall away while emotional truth remains, but that emotional truth matters. It means the sea did not simply cover land. It forced memory to do the work of landscape. Any discussion of ancient inundation eventually draws the mind toward flood stories. They appear in many places, across many cultures, and with many meanings. Some are tied to river worlds, where seasonal flooding shapes life. Some are moral or cosmic stories in which water becomes judgment, cleansing, chaos, or renewal. Some may preserve distant environmental memory. Others may arise independently, because flood is one of the most natural forms of destruction human beings experience. So it is understandable that the Black Sea has often been linked to later traditions of overwhelming water. A dramatic prehistoric flooding event in a region connected, directly or indirectly, to later cultural worlds makes the idea tempting. Perhaps people displaced from drowned margins carried stories with them. Perhaps those stories changed over generations, passed through migration and retelling, and eventually became part of wider narrative traditions. The possibility is real enough to think about. But temptation is not proof. It would be a mistake to say that the Black Sea simply explains all major flood myths, or that one geological episode can be confidently placed behind stories separated by time, language, and cultural transformation. Human storytelling is more complicated than that, and water catastrophes are too common in human experience to require one single source. Ancient people lived with storms, river floods, coastal surges, lake changes, and many local disasters. Myth is not a direct transcript of geology. Yet even after all that caution, the Black Sea remains relevant to the broader theme of flood memory. It offers a credible setting in which large-scale inundation of inhabited margins could have occurred. It offers a humanly memorable kind of loss, not only water, but water taking known land. And that matters, because stories often preserve not measurements, but feelings. They remember that boundaries failed. They remember that people fled. They remember that familiar ground was taken by an element that crossed where it should not have crossed. In that sense, the Black Sea may fit not as a universal key, but as one strong example of how environmental disaster becomes narrative pressure. A community loses place. Survivors carry warning. Children inherit a simpler version of a complicated event. Over time, practical memory becomes story. Story becomes identity, and identity reshapes the story into forms later listeners can understand. No exact coastline survives in such a process, but emotional structure can. This is perhaps the safest and most meaningful way to connect the Black Sea with wider human memory. Not by claiming too much, but by recognizing that drowned landscapes are exactly the kind of thing human beings would remember in story long after detail had faded. The sea becomes larger than a local fact. It becomes a lesson about the fragility of the world. At the beginning of this script, the phrase "an entire country lies beneath the Black Sea" carried a dramatic charge. By now, after moving through drowned shorelines, disputed flood pace, human plausibility, underwater clues, and the unknown number of the dead, that phrase can be understood more carefully. The country beneath the sea was not necessarily a political entity. It was not a kingdom with a capital, nor a unified culture with one language, nor a bordered state in any modern sense. It was something older and more widely human than that. It was a country made of use and repetition. A country of shore camps, landing places, work areas, burial grounds, pathways, reed beds, fishing waters, household routines, and familiar turns in the land. A country of return. A country that existed because people recognized its patterns and organized their lives around them. In that sense, the word is justified. Human beings have always lived inside countries of belonging long before they lived inside countries of administration. This kind of country also leaves a difficult historical trace. It does not announce itself through inscriptions and monuments. It leaves lighter marks: pottery, timber, hearths, bones, paths, repeated occupation surfaces, maybe fragments of structures, maybe only enough to suggest a pattern. Its emotional richness is not matched by durable visibility. That is why the drowned world beneath the Black Sea feels so elusive. It may have mattered enormously to those who lived there, yet survive only in partial material hints and the broad logic of human settlement. There is a sadness in that mismatch. Later history often seems to honor what was built in stone and forget what was built in habit. But most human life has always been built in habit. Most homes in all of history were ordinary. Most belonging attached to landscapes that could be transformed, abandoned, or erased without ever becoming famous. The Black Sea gives us a rare glimpse of how much human significance can sink without ceremony. And because the people of that drowned country have left us so few names, we are forced into a different moral posture. We cannot remember them individually. We cannot even count them. What we can do is resist turning them into scenery. We can speak of them as real people living within a real landscape whose disappearance mattered. The absence of names should make us gentler, not colder. This is one reason the Black Sea story lingers so deeply. It is not only about a vanished environment. It is about the ordinary majority of human history, the people whose worlds mattered completely to them, and left almost nothing that later power considered worth preserving. Beneath the sea may lie one of those worlds, broad enough to feel like a country, humble enough to be forgotten almost entirely. Seas keep time differently than people do. A human life is brief enough that a shoreline can appear permanent. A few generations can mistake a temporary arrangement of water and land for the natural order of things. The sea is not deceiving anyone when that happens. It is simply moving at a scale that ordinary memory struggles to hold. The Black Sea reminds us of that with unusual force. What seems fixed on the modern map is, in the deeper view, only one phase in a longer sequence. This does not make the human grief attached to drowned landscapes any smaller. In fact, it deepens it. The people living on the lost margins of the ancient basin had every reason to trust the ground they knew, because trust is what makes settlement possible. No one can build a life while constantly imagining every place as temporary. Belonging requires a degree of faith in continuity. That is why environmental change hurts so much when it becomes large enough. It does not merely alter resources, it betrays the ordinary trust that daily life requires. The sea's patience also explains why the Black Sea can feel calm and eerie at once. The event or process that drowned the old margins did not need to be theatrical at every stage in order to be devastating. Whether the waters rushed in dramatic phases or rose through drawn-out transformation, the sea possessed one advantage no human community could match: time. People had to decide within seasons and lifetimes. The basin changed across scales larger than those. In the contest between ordinary settlement and patient water, the water did not need urgency. It only needed persistence. This is true in many eras, and perhaps that is another reason the Black Sea story feels contemporary despite its age. Modern people, too, live with the uneasy knowledge that coasts move, seas rise, and familiar ground can fail. We have instruments, projections, and satellite measurements, but the emotional structure is not entirely different. We still rely on ordinary trust. We still hope our local shore will remain legible to our children. We still speak of vulnerable coasts, as though recognition itself might stabilize them. The Black Sea, therefore, belongs to prehistory, but it also belongs to a wider human pattern. It is a warning from a distant time, though not in a simple moralizing sense. It does not say that the past had easy lessons waiting for us. It says something more difficult. It says that whole human worlds can disappear gradually enough to become uncertain in memory, and completely enough to become difficult in evidence. The sea teaches this very slowly, and that slowness is part of its power. By the final part of a story like this, there is always a temptation to sharpen everything into a final grand claim. But the Black Sea deserves something better than that. It deserves an honest closing. So let us set down, calmly, what can be said with confidence, what remains plausible, and what must stay open. We can say that parts of the landscape beneath the modern Black Sea were once dry land or lower exposed margins connected to ancient shore environments. We can say that sea level and basin conditions changed profoundly after the Ice Age, and that the Black Sea's relationship to surrounding waters was central to that transformation. We can say that human communities plausibly lived along the vulnerable margins of that older landscape, because people consistently favored such ecologically rich edges elsewhere, and because the wider regional prehistory supports that possibility. We can also say that the exact pace and character of the flooding or marine transgression remain debated. Some interpretations emphasize dramatic inflow and relatively rapid change. Others emphasize a slower, more complex process. The truth may include local variation and multiple phases. We can say that because of this uncertainty, and because prehistoric population is so difficult to reconstruct, Nobody can responsibly give a confident number for those who drowned. Some likely died directly. Many likely moved. Others may have suffered through displacement and its after effects in ways that can never be counted precisely. We can further say that the Black Sea has strong potential as an underwater archive. Ancient shorelines, drowned channels, environmental sequences, and perhaps in some cases preserved human traces make it one of the most evocative settings in the world for thinking about submerged prehistory. Yet we should also say that a clue is not a conclusion, and that the story remains stronger when its ambiguity is respected. And finally, we can say something that is less technical and perhaps more important. Beneath the Black Sea there may lie not just land, but a lost human horizon. Not a legendary empire, not necessarily a single unified civilization, but a broad and meaningful world of ordinary people whose country in the old human sense their lived country was taken by water. That is enough to make the story weighty even without exaggeration. The past does not need embellishment when it already contains this kind of silence. Some historical questions remain alive because they are unsolved puzzles. Others endure because even partial answers change how we see ourselves. The Black Sea belongs to the second kind. Whether or not every detail is ever settled, the possibility of a drowned human world beneath its waters alters the emotional landscape of the sea forever. Once you imagine ancient people standing on ground now far below the surface, the modern shoreline becomes a late chapter rather than the whole book. It also alters our sense of human fragility. We often think of disappearance as something dramatic and obvious. Civilizations fall, cities burn, armies vanish. But the Black Sea presents a quieter kind of disappearance. Land is overtaken, memory carries what it can, the dead lose their number, the living adapt elsewhere. Over enough time, the vanished world becomes almost impossible to describe without sounding poetic, because ordinary factual language struggles with loss on that scale when the evidence is incomplete. That is why the story keeps returning in different forms. Archaeologists are drawn by the possibility of preserved traces. Geologists are drawn by the basin history and the contested flood models. Writers and listeners are drawn by the emotional image of a country underwater. All of them are responding to different facets of the same deep problem: how to think about a real human world that may have disappeared before history was ready to record it. There is also, perhaps, something calming in the mystery despite its sadness. The Black Sea does not demand a verdict all at once. It allows patience. It asks us to sit with evidence, uncertainty, and human consequence together. It asks us to admit that not every important past event yields a final neat answer. Some remain partly submerged, both literally and intellectually. To many minds that feels frustrating. To others, it feels appropriate. A drowned world should not be easy to reconstruct. And maybe this is the deepest reason the mystery endures. It mirrors the condition of memory itself. We never recover the past completely. We recover it in shapes, fragments, sediments, stories, and stubborn clues. The Black Sea simply makes that condition visible in a particularly haunting way. It has covered a past without fully erasing it, leaving us to read what remains. If you have stayed with me all the way to this point, thank you. These long histories are always a little like walking an old shoreline in low light. You cannot see everything at once. The shape of the place takes time. And if this is the kind of journey you like, subscribe and come back for more of them. I'd also love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are as these thoughts about the Black Sea drift across the room with you. I always find it comforting to imagine these stories being heard in different cities, different countries, and different late-night hours. The reason that small ritual matters is simple. History is not only about the dead. It is also about the living who keep company with the dead by remembering carefully. Every time a lost world is considered with patience instead of spectacle, something worthwhile happens. The people who vanished without account are not brought back, but they are not left entirely alone either. They are given a little of our attention, which is one of the few things later generations can offer honestly. And the Black Sea, perhaps more than many places, seems to invite that kind of attention. Its surface can look calm, its depths can look empty, yet both impressions are misleading. The calm covers argument, evidence, drowned land, possible homes, and the old edges of a human country. The emptiness is not empty at all. It is full of transformed meaning. So, if you ever look at a map of the Black Sea again, it may appear slightly different now, not only as water between lands, but as water laid over another land, not only as a sea, but as a memory chamber, not only as geography, but as the latest condition of an older world. There is an image worth holding on to as we end, not a flood wave, not a ruin lit by some dramatic beam, something quieter. Picture a horizon below the modern horizon. An older shoreline where people once looked out over water or wetland and believed, as people always do, that tomorrow would arrive in roughly the same shape as today. Somewhere beneath the Black Sea, that expectation failed. The great sadness is that we cannot fully enter that world. We cannot stand on that shore as it was. We cannot hear the exact words spoken when the water crossed an old boundary. We cannot count the households. We cannot count the drowned. We cannot know which stories later carried a trace of the event, and which did not. We have only the modern sea, the clues beneath it, and the persistent feeling that a human horizon lies below. But perhaps that is enough. Not enough to satisfy every argument, and not enough to close every debate, but enough to change the way we hold the past. Enough to remember that history includes worlds that vanished before they were fully named. Enough to remember that ordinary people have always lived on thresholds they mistook for permanence. Enough to remember that silence in the record can hide immense human consequence. The Black Sea keeps that lesson in a particularly deep register. It does not shout. It covers. It preserves. It distorts. It withholds. It lets us infer more than we can prove, and perhaps that is why its mystery feels so enduring. A lost country beneath the sea is not only a topic. It is a reminder that the earth is full of former worlds, and that some of them remain just close enough to sense, but never quite close enough to recover whole. And so we end where the story has been leading all along, with the double nature of the Black Sea. It is an archive because it preserves drowned landscapes, environmental transitions, and perhaps fragments of human life. It is forgetting because it has hidden those things, scattered their context, removed their voices, and taken away the count of the dead. To think about the Black Sea honestly is to hold both truths at once. Below its waters there may be the remains of a broad inhabited margin, perhaps large enough in human terms to feel like an entire lost country. Yet whatever was lost there is not recoverable in full. The archive will always be partial. The forgetting will always be deep. That is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. The final impression, then, is not one of solved mystery, but of altered vision. The Black Sea is no longer merely a modern sea on a map. It is also the roof over an older landscape. It is the place where land became memory, and memory perhaps became story. It is a basin in which the people who once belonged to its lower shores may still persist indirectly in sediments, in drowned contours, in buried traces, in unresolved theories, and possibly in the long afterlife of remembered water. Nobody knows how many people drowned beneath the making of the modern Black Sea. That line remains true, but it means more now than it did at the beginning. it no longer sounds like a dramatic mystery alone. It sounds like the honest limit of what later history can recover from a prehistoric disaster that may have erased its own arithmetic. And around that unknowable number stands everything we have traced together: the drowned coast, the changing basin, the plausible settlements, the underwater clues, the migrations, the memory, the silence. Somewhere beneath the Black Sea, the old horizon may still be there. And above it, in the quiet, the water keeps its place,